Chapter 1. Feeling the Difference. Loneliness versus Solitude. Let's start with a feeling, rather than a dry dictionary definition. Picture yourself completely alone in a quiet room. It's late, and for once the world has stopped making demands of you. There are no messages lighting up your phone screen, no footsteps echoing in the hallway, and no TV humming in the background to fill the void. It is just you and the space around you. For a modern person used to constant stimulation, this moment is the ultimate litmus test. For some people, that sudden silence lands like a heavy, suffocating blanket. It presses down on the chest and makes time feel agonizingly slow. You might find yourself checking your phone just to make sure it's still working, or feeling a phantom vibration in your pocket because the brain is so desperate for input. In this state, the room feels like it's shrinking. The quiet isn't peace. It feels like evidence. It feels like proof that something is missing, that you've been left behind while the real life is happening somewhere else without you. But for other people, that exact same silence feels like breathing fresh air after being stuck in a crowded elevator. It's the physical sensation of finally exhaling after a long, noisy day. It's the feeling of having enough space to stretch your mind out without bumping into someone else's opinions or demands. In this kind of quiet, being alone doesn't feel like rejection or isolation. It feels like freedom. It's a chance to recharge a battery that has been drained by social friction. That difference in reaction matters immensely because being alone isn't just one static thing. A theologian named Paul Tillich once pointed out something simple but surprisingly deep about the English language. He noted that we have, in a way, created two distinct words for the same physical situation. One word captures the pain of the experience, and the other captures the beauty. Tillich said that language has wisely sensed the two sides of being alone, giving us the word loneliness to describe the suffering and solitude to describe the glory. So, right from the beginning, we have a map to navigate this terrain. Loneliness is not just the objective fact that no one is around. You can be physically alone without being lonely, just as you can be incredibly lonely in a crowded stadium. Researchers often describe loneliness as multidimensional, meaning it hits us on several levels at once. It can be cognitive, that nagging, intrusive thought that you don't matter much to anyone or that no one truly gets you. But it is also deeply emotional. It manifests as a physical ache, a hunger, or a quiet panic that says, I need someone else to validate me because I cannot hold myself up right now. In that sense, loneliness feels like poverty. I don't mean financial poverty, but a poverty of connection. It is a profound feeling of not having enough, not enough warmth, not enough recognition, not enough reassurance. It is the desperate sense that the self is insufficient on its own, so it reaches out into the world. In the modern age, we often do this reaching out digitally, scrolling through feeds hoping for a dopamine hit of connection, only to find nothing substantial to hold on to. We end up social snacking, consuming little bites of interaction that distract us but never actually nourish us. Solitude, on the other hand, has a completely different shape. While it also involves being alone, it usually begins with agency and choice. You step away on purpose. You become separated not because you were abandoned or excluded, but because you are engaging in an intentional act. Some writers even describe solitude as a kind of self-imposed geographical isolation. It's not that you hate people, it's that you have a specific reason to be with yourself. Think of the artist locking the studio door, the runner going for a long trail run without headphones, or someone sitting in a park simply to watch the leaves fall. That little detail, choice, changes everything. Solitude is not merely the absence of people, it is the presence of the self. It is the feeling that even if no one else is around, you are still in good company, because you can inhabit your own mind without fear. In solitude, you can sit with your thoughts without needing to drown them out with a podcast or music. You can listen to your feelings without immediately trying to numb them or escape them. Solitude becomes an active state, almost like a craft or a discipline. It isn't something that happens to you, it is something you do. It is an intentional act of enrichment where you are building a relationship with the one person you are guaranteed to spend the entire life with, yourself. This topic feels especially urgent today. Over the last decade, and particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, concern about loneliness has grown from a murmur to a shout. Many sociologists describe it like a rising tide that has become a torrent. Even when the lockdowns ended and restrictions lifted, the habit of disconnection remained for a lot of us. It's as if many people re-entered society but forgot the mechanics of true connection. We can be surrounded by faces on a subway or in an office and still feel completely unseen. We can be in constant online contact, texting, tagging, emailing, and still feel emotionally marooned. So, in a strange paradox, we live in an age with more communication tools than at any point in human history, yet many people feel a deeper, sharper loneliness than they expected. One reason for this might be that we have lost the art of solitude. Because we carry supercomputers in our pockets, we never have to be bored, and we never have to be alone with our thoughts. But because we never practice being alone, when it finally happens, it feels terrifying. When the capacity for solitude disappears, loneliness grows more dangerous. If you cannot be peacefully alone, then every empty moment becomes a threat. Every quiet Tuesday evening becomes something you have to escape with noise, distraction, or substances. Life becomes a constant, exhausting search for entertainment, anything that keeps you from facing that silence. But what if that silence could become a friend? What if instead of being crushed by the weight of your own company, you could learn to use it? That is exactly what this series is about. We aren't just going to talk about the problem, we're going to look for the solution in history and practice. In the chapters ahead, we're going to travel through time. We'll visit what we might call the laboratories of solitude. We'll look at the caves, cabins, towers, tents, monasteries, and mountain paths where people went to be alone. We'll meet the thinkers, poets, artists, and spiritual teachers who entered silence not as a punishment, but as a practice. These weren't people who just hid from the world. They were people who learned to turn aloneness into clarity, creativity, strength, and sometimes a kind of quiet, resilient joy. Along the way, we'll keep returning to that same gentle distinction we started with. Loneliness is often a condition to be endured, a pain that asks for healing and connection. But solitude is a capacity to be developed, a skill that can be learned just like playing an instrument or training a muscle. And if we learn it, if we practice it, the quiet room that we once feared might slowly become something else entirely. It won't be a cage that traps us, it will be a sanctuary that restores us.
Chapter 2. Go Solo Like a Rhino. The Rhinoceros Sutra.
Let's drift back in time for a moment, far away from our cramped cities, endless notifications, and glowing screens. We are going to the ancient forests of northern India. It is early morning, and the air is heavy, warm, and damp. High above, dense leaves brush against one another, filtering the sunlight into beams of green and gold. Somewhere in the distance, birds are calling out across the canopy. But down here, the ground is soft and the world feels muted. Then you hear a sound. It isn't the skittering of a nervous prey animal. It is heavy, rhythmic, and completely unhurried. Something large is moving through the undergrowth, crushing dried leaves with absolute confidence. This creature is the inspiration for one of the oldest Buddhist poems in existence, a short but punchy text known as the Rhinoceros Sutra, or in the original Pali, the Kaggavisana Sutta. This text comes from a very specific era in history, a time before institutional Buddhism really took off, when spiritual teachings weren't shared as abstract university theories or complex lists of rules. Instead, wisdom was shared through images you could feel in your gut. At the heart of this sutra is a simple, thumping refrain that gets repeated at the end of every verse like a heartbeat. Wander alone like a rhinoceros. The image is striking, maybe even a little unsettling to a modern mind that has been trained to view being alone as a problem to be solved. We are social creatures, after all. But the Indian rhino, the specific animal this poem references, is a fascinating creature. Unlike the African rhino, which often has two horns, the Indian rhino typically has just one. It is massive, covered in thick, folded skin that looks like armor, and it is solitary by nature. It doesn't move in herds for safety. It doesn't look to a leader for direction. It walks its own path through the forest, slow, grounded, and completely self-contained. In the sutra, this animal becomes a symbol for a very specific type of spiritual figure known as the Pratyeka Buddha, or a solitary realizer. Think of this as the difference between taking a guided class and teaching yourself a complex skill from scratch. A solitary realizer is someone who reaches insight and awakening without a teacher, without a support group, and without an audience to applaud them. They don't do this because they are arrogant or because they hate people. They do it because their understanding grows inwardly, in silence, and they realize that sometimes the noise of the group drowns out the truth. The poem uses some incredibly gentle, almost lullaby-like metaphors to describe this rugged way of being. For example, the solitary walker is said to be unsnared, like the wind passing through a net. It's a beautiful visual. Imagine a net hanging in the air, carefully woven to trap something solid. But the wind blows right through the holes. It cannot be held, caught, or restricted. The sutra suggests a person comfortable with solitude can move through the world the same way, present and participating, but not getting tangled up in the drama or the expectations of others. These images aren't hostile toward life or other people. Rather, they are realistic warnings about how easily we get tripped up. The sutra observes very plainly that social entanglements often act as fuel for passion, aversion, and delusion. Think about it. How much of our modern stress comes from trying to impress people? How much anger comes from political arguments with strangers on the internet? Desire pulls us one way, resentment pushes us another. Before we know it, we are exhausted and have lost sight of who we actually are. There's even a line in the text that feels surprisingly, almost cynically modern. It notes that friends without hidden motives are rare, and that many people act with their own interests quietly in mind. This isn't meant to make you bitter or paranoid. It's just realism. It's a calm acknowledgement that human relationships are often transactional. People want things. When you rely entirely on others for your sense of self, you're building your house on very shaky ground. And yet, this teaching doesn't come from a place of fear or withdrawal. The solitude praised here isn't fragile, it's incredibly strong. The sutra offers another powerful image. The solitary one is unstartled, like a lion at sounds. Picture a gazelle in the wild. If a twig snaps, the gazelle flinches. It is constantly scanning for threats, living in a state of high alert anxiety. Now picture a lion. A lion hears the same twig snap, but it doesn't panic. It turns its head slowly. It assesses the situation. It remains still, aware, but not shaken. This is a vital detail. The rhinoceros or the lion doesn't walk alone because it is afraid of the other animals. It walks alone because it is steady enough to do so. It doesn't need the herd to feel safe. This is where the teaching pivots and points a finger quietly at us. Today, the sounds that startle us are rarely physical threats like predators in the bushes. Our sounds are internal and digital. It's the ping of a notification, the buzz of social comparison when you see someone else's highlight reel on Instagram, the fear of missing out that grips you on a Friday night, the anxious, nagging question of whether we are being seen, liked, or validated by the algorithm. Many of us find it nearly impossible to sit in a quiet room for 20 minutes without reaching for a phone, a remote, or a snack, anything to fill the space. We are easily startled by the sound of our own thoughts. The Rhinoceros Sutra asks us, gently but firmly, can you become unstartled? Can you sit with yourself without immediately reacting to every inner noise? Can you let an anxious thought pass through your mind like wind through a net without reaching out and grabbing it? It is important to note that the sutra is not preaching extreme antisocial behavior. It clearly acknowledges that companionship is valuable. It says that if you can find a prudent companion, someone wise, someone whose presence supports clarity rather than confusion, someone who elevates you, then you should walk with them. That is a gift. But, and this is a big but, if such a companion cannot be found, the text is ruthless in its advice. It says it is better to walk alone than to move backward with the foolish. In our modern context, this means having standards. It means realizing that being alone is infinitely better than being in a toxic friendship, a draining relationship, or a mindless crowd. In that sense, walking alone becomes an act of deep respect for your own mind. So, this chapter leaves us with a quiet, enduring image, a solitary figure moving through a dense forest. They aren't rushing to get somewhere else. They aren't lonely or crying out for attention. They aren't angry at the world for not understanding them. They are just steady, just present. They are walking alone, not because there is no one else around, but because the path they are on is enough.
Chapter 3. Drifting like an empty boat. Taoist wisdom.
As we leave the dense, humid forests of ancient India behind, our journey begins to soften significantly. We are trading the heavy, grounded footsteps of the rhinoceros for something more fluid. The air grows cooler, and the solid ground gives way to water. The jagged mountains fade into a soft mist, and we find ourselves drifting down a wide river in the landscape of ancient China. Here, the mood changes completely. We are stepping away from the ideals of strength, armor, and unshakable will, and entering a world shaped by flow, yielding, and quiet movement. This chapter draws its wisdom from the rich tradition of Taoism, specifically from a short but deeply revealing story found in the writings of Zhuangzi, often spelled Chuang-Tu. Zhuangzi was a philosopher who loved to use humor and absurdity to break our rigid ways of thinking. The story we're looking at is so simple that it almost feels like a bedtime tale you might tell a child, yet it carries a psychological lesson that can completely overhaul the way we experience stress and conflict in the modern world. Imagine a man crossing a misty river in his own small boat. He is minding his own business, perhaps enjoying the silence. The water is calm at first, and his attention begins to drift. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he notices another boat moving toward him. It's coming fast. At first, he assumes someone must be steering it. He calls out, "Hey, watch out! Shift your course!" He waves his arms frantically. He adjusts his own rudder, trying to avoid a collision. But the other boat keeps coming, relentless and straight. As the distance closes, the man's irritation spikes. He begins to feel personally wronged. His mind instantly writes a script about the person in the other boat. How careless is this guy? How rude! Doesn't he see me? He must be an idiot or a jerk to sail like this. By the time the boats actually collide with a loud wooden thunk, the man's frustration has boiled over into full-blown rage. He stands up, ready to scream at the incompetent sailor who ruined his morning. And then, in that very moment, he looks inside the other boat. It is empty. There is no steersman, there is no enemy, there is no insult. The boat had simply drifted loose from its moorings upstream and followed the current of the river until it bumped into him. Instantly, and this is the crucial part, the man's anger dissolves. It evaporates. There is no one left to blame, no one to confront, and nothing to take personally. The physical reality hasn't changed, the boat still hit him, but his experience of the event has completely shifted. What remains is only the river moving as rivers do. This is the heart of the Taoist lesson, and it is a massive shift in perspective. Zhuangzi, of course, is not really talking about wooden boats. He is talking about us and how we move through society. Most of the time, when we feel hurt, offended, or angry, it is because we are convinced there is a steersman on the other side of the collision. We believe there is intent. When a car cuts us off in traffic, we think, that guy is disrespecting me. When a colleague sends a curt email, we think, she's trying to undermine me. When a friend forgets our birthday, we think, they don't care about me. We are constantly filling the empty boats of the world with villains, creating enemies out of accidents. But the truth is, very often, the boat is empty. The person who cut you off might be rushing to a hospital, panic-stricken. The colleague might be drowning in her own workload and didn't even read her own email for tone. The friend might be struggling with depression and forgot everyone's birthday, not just yours. They are acting from habit, confusion, fear, or circumstance. They are drifting in the currents of their own lives. Even more importantly, Taoism flips the mirror around. It suggests that the collision only hurts because we are carrying too much inside our own boat. Taoism invites us to become the empty boat. This is a concept that is often misunderstood. It does not mean becoming a doormat, letting people walk all over you, or becoming a passive ghost in your own life. It means emptying the boat of the ego, that heavy, cluttered part of us that insists on being defended at all costs. Think about what fills your boat. The need for recognition. Do they know who I am? The need to be right. The obsession with status. The fragile self-image that shatters the moment someone offers a critique. That is a lot of heavy cargo. When your boat is full of ego, you present a massive target to the world. Every ripple rocks you. Every collision feels like a declaration of war. But in Taoist solitude, being alone is not just about physical separation. It is about releasing that inner weight. It is the practice of lightening your load. When you are empty in the Taoist sense, you don't take things personally. You become transparent. When the boat is empty, even a collision cannot truly harm you because there is no solid, rigid self inside to be offended. You simply float around the obstacle and keep going. This idea flows naturally into the teachings of the other great Taoist sage, Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching. He speaks often about returning to the root. Lao Tzu observes that everything in nature follows a rhythm of expansion and return. Look at the world around you. Plants grow, they stretch upward, they flower, and they flourish in the sunlight. We love that part, the growth, the hustle, the bloom. But eventually, without struggle and without regret, they return to the root. They drop their leaves, they pull their energy back in, they settle back into stillness. And that stillness is not death, it is balance. It is where the energy for the next spring comes from. To return to the root, Lao Tzu says, is to return to what is real. In our modern world, we are terrible at this. We are obsessed with eternal summer, eternal growth, and eternal noise. We think if we are not moving forward, we are failing. But solitude, in the Taoist view, is the necessary winter of the soul. It is not a withdrawal from life, but a return to its source. It is the moment when striving relaxes, when the constant, exhausting effort to become something more finally softens into simply being. You can picture it like a leaf drifting down from a tree in autumn. It does not rush to the ground. It does not argue with gravity. It does not worry about where it will land. It settles on the forest floor again, becoming part of the quiet earth again. When the mind rests in that kind of stillness, even for just 20 minutes a day, perception becomes clear. Thoughts arise and pass away without interference. Emotions come and go without being chased or resisted. The rigid boundary between me and the world begins to feel less like a stone wall and more like a permeable membrane. In that state, even noise loses its power. Even a crashing boat becomes just another ripple on the river. So, this chapter leaves us floating gently, carried by water rather than pushing against it. We are learning that solitude doesn't always have to be about the stoic endurance of the rhino in the forest. It can be softer. Taoist solitude is not about standing apart in defiance. It is about releasing ourselves into the flow of existence, lightening the boat until nothing inside needs defending. And when the boat is truly empty, the river can do what it has always done. It can carry us, quietly and without effort, all the way home.
Chapter 4. Beast or God? Aristotle, on being alone.
Now, let's step into a very different world. We're leaving the damp, silent forests of India and the misty rivers of China behind. Instead, we find ourselves in a place where the air is bright, dry, and crackling with energy. Stone columns glow amber under the relentless Mediterranean sun, and everywhere you look, there is movement. Voices echo between marble walls as people argue, persuade, joke, gossip, and philosophize. This is ancient Athens, a city built not just of limestone and marble, but of conversation. In this culture, to be human was to be visible. The Greeks didn't really believe in the private individual in the way we do today. Citizens gathered daily in the agora, the marketplace, to talk. Ideas were tested out loud, in public. Your reputation was your currency. To withdraw too far from public life wasn't seen as a healthy detox or self-care. It was seen as suspicious. In fact, the Greek word for a private person who didn't participate in public affairs is idiots, the root of our modern word, idiot. It is in this hyper-social setting that we meet Aristotle. Imagine him walking among the colonnades of the Lyceum, observing human behavior with the same rigorous attention he gave to biology. Aristotle looked at how people lived, and he made a statement about solitude that still feels incredibly sharp and perhaps a little judgmental today. He famously said that anyone who delights in solitude, anyone who doesn't need society, is either a wild beast or a god. It is a startling claim, especially after the gentle encouragement we've seen in the previous chapters about rhinos and empty boats. But Aristotle isn't simply dismissing solitude. He is pointing to a high-stakes tension at the very heart of human nature. He is suggesting that solitude is a perilous cliff. You either fly or you fall. For Aristotle, human beings are what he called zoon politikon, political animals. He didn't mean political in the modern sense of voting, taxes, and arguing about elections. He meant political in the sense of the polis, the city-state. He believes that humans are hardwired to be social. We become fully ourselves only through shared life, shared language, and shared moral rules. We need friction with other people to polish our characters. In that worldview, a man who lived entirely outside the city walls was a glitch in the matrix. If someone could not live with others, Aristotle thought something had gone wrong. First, there is the risk of becoming the beast. We all know what this looks like in modern life. When the external pressure of society is removed, when we don't have to dress up for work, interact with neighbors, or maintain social niceties, some of us begin to unravel. We've all had those weekends where we didn't leave the house and things got a little feral. Daily routines fall apart. We stop eating off plates and start eating out of cartons. Sleep becomes irregular. Hygiene slips. The mind, lacking the structure of conversation, starts to feed on itself. It becomes driven by appetite, impulse, and instinct. In Aristotle's terms, this kind of solitude pulls us downward. It strips away our humanity and leaves us restless and chaotic. But Aristotle, being a fair observer, allowed for another possibility. That solitary figure might not be degrading into a beast, they might be elevating into a god. This is the upward path of solitude. This describes a being so complete, so inwardly rich and self-sufficient that they need nothing from others to feel whole. Aristotle associated this with theory, contemplation. Today, we might call this deep work or a flow state, but for the Greeks, it was even more spiritual. It is a state where the mind is active, clear, and orderly. This kind of solitude is not about hiding from the world because you can't cope. It's about stepping back to understand the world more deeply. It mirrors the divine life, which lacks nothing and depends on no one. So the question Aristotle quietly places before us is not whether we are alone, we all will be at some point, but what kind of aloneness we are practicing. When the crowd disappears and the door clicks shut, what happens to you? Do you sink or do you rise? Later philosophers, especially the Stoics, took this godlike idea and ran with it. They argued that the goal of life is to be inwardly stable regardless of your circumstances. It's not about a cold, arrogant independence where you don't need love. It's about an inner fortress that doesn't collapse just because you are left on your own for a while. Centuries later, the English philosopher Francis Bacon added a gentle, necessary correction to Aristotle's city-centered view. He looked at the bustling cities of his own time and observed that a crowd is not the same as company. You can be surrounded by people and still be isolated. Faces, Bacon wrote, are but a gallery of pictures, and talk but a tinkling cymbal where there is no love. This hits home for anyone living in a modern metropolis like New York, London, or Tokyo. It is entirely possible to live in the heart of a city surrounded by millions of political animals and still feel utterly alone. Conversely, it is possible to be physically alone in a quiet room, yet inwardly rich, accompanied by great ideas, fond memories, and quiet insight. This brings Aristotle's challenge right to our doorstep. Solitude acts as a diagnostic tool. It reveals the content of your character. When we are alone, do we treat it as abandonment, panicking and reaching for our phones to scroll through the lives of others? Do we neglect ourselves because no one is watching, or do we treat solitude as a sanctuary for growth? Do we use the silence to think thoughts we couldn't hear over the noise of the crowd? Athens reminds us that humans are meant to be seen and heard. We are shaped by our relationships. But Aristotle reminds us that solitude is the ultimate test of our substance. It asks a difficult question. Can you remain whole when the audience leaves the theater? To face yourself directly without the distraction of the city is risky. To do it without slipping into beast mode, lazy, resentful, and chaotic, requires discipline. But to do it well enough to touch that godlike state of clarity requires courage. So as we leave Aristotle's sunlit city behind, the question lingers in the air. When the noise stops, who do you become? And can you learn to be alone, not as something broken that needs fixing, but as something complete that just needs space?
Chapter 5. Ignoring the Bathhouse Racket. Seneca's Inner Quiet.
Now we return to the ancient world. but we are leaving the quiet forests and riverbanks behind. We are dropping right into the chaotic heart of the empire, the crowded, sweaty, shouting streets of first-century Rome. Imagine a small, plainly furnished room perched high above the street in a rickety apartment block. The walls are paper-thin, the air is thick and warm, and directly beneath this room sits one of the busiest, loudest public establishments in the entire city: a bathhouse. This is where the famous Stoic philosopher Seneca finds himself trying to read, think, and write. If you picture a Roman bathhouse as a serene, spa-like sanctuary with cucumbers on ice and gentle harp music, think again. It was more like a combination of a crowded locker room, a loud pub, and a CrossFit gym. In a letter to his friend Lucilius, Seneca describes the situation with hilarious and relatable honesty. He tells his friend, almost with a weary sigh, that he is surrounded by literally every kind of noise that can make a person hate their own ears. As we read his description, the centuries melt away, and we can hear exactly what he's dealing with. Below him, he hears the gym bros of antiquity, men straining and grunting as they lift heavy lead weights. Their breathing is sharp and forceful, mixed with the dull clank of metal hitting stone. He hears the slap of massages, the hissing of people catching their breath after a cold plunge, and the loud splashes of enthusiasts doing cannonballs into the pool, followed by the echoing roar of laughter. But there is one specific sound that drives him crazier than all the others: the hair plucker. In ancient Rome, body hair removal was a service offered at the baths, often done by plucking. Seneca describes a man whose entire job is to advertise this service with a shrill, high-pitched cry, repeating it over and over so that no one can possibly ignore him. He only shuts up when he's actually plucking someone's armpits and making them scream instead. It is sensory overload. It is absolute chaos. It is the exact opposite of the lo-fi beats for studying we usually think we need to get any work done. And yet, Seneca tells this story not to complain or to ask for sympathy. He tells it to prove a point about the human mind. What Seneca discovers, sitting in that vibrating room above the bathhouse, is something both deeply unsettling and deeply comforting. He realizes that external quiet is not nearly as necessary as we tell ourselves it is. We often say, "I can't focus because it's too loud," or "I need to go to the library to think." Seneca calls bluff on this. He argues that true solitude doesn't depend on the external silence outside of us, it depends entirely on the silence within us. Rather than fleeing the noise or moving to a different apartment, Seneca uses the racket as a training ground. He treats the noise like a sparring partner. He deliberately practices forcing his mind to withdraw into itself, ignoring the auditory input. He notices a crucial mechanic of the brain. As long as fear is not wrestling with desire inside his chest, the noise outside loses its grip on him. This is a core Stoic concept. The noise is just sound waves hitting the eardrum. That part is physics. The annoyance is a judgment. That part is mental. He realizes that if his passions are calm, if he isn't sitting there wishing he was elsewhere or fearing he won't finish his work, the bathhouse can roar all at once. It becomes just background texture, like rain on a roof. He asks a sharp question that hits very close to home for modern people. What use is a quiet neighborhood, he wonders, if our emotions are in an uproar? What good is escaping to a silent cabin in the countryside if you bring your anxiety, your ambition, and your restlessness along for the ride? We see this all the time today. People go on digital detox retreats or expensive vacations to find peace, only to spend the whole time stressing about their itinerary, worrying about work emails, or replaying an argument they had 3 years ago. Seneca had seen the Roman version of this. He saw people flee the city to seaside villas in search of peace, only to discover that their messy minds followed them there. The scenery changed, but the inner static remained exactly the same. Centuries later, the French philosopher Blaise Pascal would echo this sentiment with his famous observation that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. While Pascal was looking at it from a slightly different angle, the spirit is unmistakably Stoic. Seneca had already diagnosed the problem. The real disturbance isn't the guy shouting about hair plucking downstairs. The real disturbance is internal. It is desire, wanting something you don't have, and fear, worrying about losing what you do have. It is the constant, frantic pulling of the mind to the future or the past. Silence, then, is not a commodity you buy by renting a soundproof studio or buying noise-canceling headphones. It is a skill you earn. Seneca's tunnel of silence is not built with brick and mortar. It is built with discipline and attention. It is the steady practice of noticing your thoughts and refusing to be dragged around by them. He even suggests that locking yourself away physically is a trap if you haven't done the inner work first. If you haven't chained the laughter and agitation inside your own head, external silence will just make the internal noise louder. But when the mind is trained, something remarkable happens. The bathhouse can thunder below, the construction crew can drill outside your window, the open-plan office can buzz with chatter, and yet inside there is stillness. You find a quiet center that doesn't react, doesn't flinch, and doesn't run away. For Seneca, this is the deepest, most robust form of solitude. It isn't fragile. It doesn't break just because a dog barks. It is a form of mastery. It is not the absence of noise, but the freedom from being ruled by it. As we leave that noisy Roman bathhouse behind, one lesson follows us. If we learn to quiet our own desire and fear, then silence is always available to us. It's available on a subway train, in a traffic jam, or in a busy airport. In fact, Seneca might say those are the best places to find it, because that is where the training is real.
Chapter 6. Chilling in a Tent by the Danube. Marcus Aurelius. As we follow the Stoic path a little further, the soundscape changes again. We are leaving behind the crowded, sweaty streets of Rome and the clanking weights of Seneca's bathhouse. We are moving north, toward the jagged outer edges of the Roman Empire. Here the air grows colder, biting at exposed skin. The light becomes thin and gray, filtered through low clouds that drift above a wide, dark river. Beyond that water lie dense forests filled with uncertainty, threat, and Germanic tribes who are not exactly thrilled to see the Romans. It is around the year 170 AD, along the muddy banks of the Danube, near what is now Vienna. Roman military camps stretch across the landscape, their fires glowing faintly in the mist like dying stars. The smell is distinctive, a mix of wood smoke, damp earth, wet wool, and unwashed bodies. And in the middle of this harsh, grim frontier sits a simple tent. Inside that tent, late at night, we find Marcus Aurelius. Context is everything here. Marcus isn't a monk or a hermit. He is the emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the known world. He is the CEO of Western civilization. And yet, at this moment, he is profoundly alone. He is no longer young. His body is tired and failing him. Historians tell us he likely suffered from ulcers and chronic pain, worn down by years of crushing responsibility and an endless grinding war against the Quadi and the Marcomanni. Outside, soldiers shift in their sleep, coughing in the cold. The wind tugs at the canvas walls. Somewhere in the distance, a horse snorts. By the weak, flickering light of an oil lamp, Marcus writes quietly to himself. He isn't writing for us. He isn't writing a bestseller or a political manifesto. These notes were never meant for publication. In fact, the original title wasn't Meditations, it was likely just Tai Eis Heaton, to himself. This is a private attempt by a desperate man trying to stay sane, steady, and human in an inhumane environment. In these pages, Marcus reflects on a mental habit that is startlingly modern. He notices that people are constantly dreaming of escape. Think about how often we do this today. We browse real estate listings for cabins in the woods. We scroll through Instagram photos of beaches in Bali. We tell ourselves, if I could just get away for a week, if I could just go to the seaside or the mountains, then I would finally be at peace. We are obsessed with the geographic cure, the idea that changing our location will fix our internal state. Marcus dismisses this longing with a gentle but firm shake of the head. He calls this desire to physically escape a vulgar habit, something ordinary people do because they don't know any better. Why, he asks, would you run toward a place to find peace when the thing you are looking for is already within you? He writes that nowhere is more quiet, more free from trouble than a person's own soul. This idea becomes one of his most enduring contributions to the philosophy of solitude, the image of the inner citadel. To understand this, you have to picture ancient warfare. A citadel is the fortress inside a city. When the outer walls are breached, when the streets are overrun, the defenders retreat to the citadel. It is the last line of defense. Marcus believed each person carries such a place within their own mind. It is a protected inner space that no army can invade, no insult can destroy, and no chaos can touch, unless we hand over the keys. For Marcus, this wasn't just poetic philosophy, it was a survival strategy. On a military campaign, he had zero comfort. He had no privacy. People were constantly asking him for orders, money, or favors. He had no control over the freezing weather, the brutality of the war, or the fate of the empire. But at any moment, even in the saddle, he could retreat inward. He could close his eyes, even briefly, and enter that inner citadel. This was what we might call instant solitude. It wasn't an escape from duty, it was a pause within it. It was a way to wash the spirit clean, as he put it, before returning to the action. Marcus advised himself to do this often. He didn't wait for a sabbatical or a holiday. He engaged in micro-retreats. He would dip into his own mind to renew his perspective and then step back out to lead the army. And the best part? This retreat required no travel agent, no horses, no ships, no mountain villas. It required only a turning of attention inward. In one famous passage, Marcus reminds himself to be content with himself, to test his own character, and to keep the soul in its own company. That line captures the quiet, rugged strength of his solitude. He isn't asking to be isolated from others socially. He couldn't be. He was the emperor. He is asking to be stable within himself. He is talking about emotional self-sufficiency. The image stays with us, a soldier emperor sitting on a low wooden stool in a drafty canvas tent, scratching Greek words onto wax tablets while the fate of the world hangs in the balance. No luxury, no applause. Just a man, alone with his thoughts, choosing calm over panic. The lesson he leaves behind is surprisingly gentle and incredibly practical for us. We carry our home with us. You can be at a loud celebration, stuck in a gridlocked commute, or sitting in a stressful boardroom. You can be surrounded by people or completely alone. But if the soul is steady, if your inner citadel is intact, you are already in your best retreat. And perhaps that is the quiet paradox Marcus Aurelius discovered on the edge of the world. He traveled farther than most people ever will, marching to the very boundaries of civilization, only to learn that the deepest, most necessary journey of solitude takes place entirely within the mind.
Chapter 7. Walled in, but wide open. Julian of Norwich.
Now we are going to move forward in time, leaving the ancient world of Roman emperors and bathhouses behind. We're stepping into the muddy, bustling streets of medieval England. It is the 14th century, and the town of Norwich is not the sleepy pastoral village you might imagine. It is the second largest city in England, busy, smelly, and alive. Merchants are shouting about their wool prices, carts are clattering over cobblestones, and church bells are marking the passing hours. This is not a remote monastery perched on a silent mountain crag. It is a working town, full of noise, commerce, and movement. And right here, attached to the side of the Church of St. Julian, like a barnacle on a ship, we find one of the most radical, hardcore experiments in solitude ever undertaken by a human being. Her name is Julian of Norwich. We don't actually know her real name. She is simply named after the church she lived in. Julian chose to become what was known as an anchorite. To modern ears, that might sound nautical, like an anchor, but the meaning is much more literal. She was anchored to one spot. Being an anchorite meant voluntarily being enclosed for life inside a small stone cell called an anchor hold, built directly into the side of the church. In a very real sense, she chose to be walled in while she was still alive. At first glance, this sounds absolutely terrifying, like a horror movie scenario or a severe punishment. But for Julian, the anchor hold was not a dungeon. It was a choice. It was a small, carefully designed room, probably about the size of a modern walk-in closet or a very cramped studio apartment. The walls were whitewashed, the light was dim but gentle, and the space was meant to support a life of total prayer and contemplation. But here is the architectural detail that changes everything. The room had 3 windows. One window opened into the church interior. Through this squint, Julian could see the altar, hear the Mass, and take communion. Another window opened into a small service area or parlor where a servant could pass her food, take out waste, and ensure her basic biological survival. But it was the third window that matters most for our story. This window opened directly onto the busy street. Before Julian entered the anchor hold, a solemn, almost Gothic ceremony was held. The bishop would arrive and conduct the office of the dead. He would literally read burial prayers over her living body. Symbolically, she was declared dead to the world of status, ambition, and social climbing. The door was bolted shut and, in some cases, sealed with wax or mortar. She was the ghost in the machine of the city. And yet, from that moment on, she became more present to the world than ever before. Through that small street-facing window, the community came to her. Neighbors, travelers, the worried, the grieving, and the confused would tap on the shutter. They spoke to her through the thick stone wall, seeking counsel, comfort, and sanity. Julian wasn't a hermit hiding in a cave. She was a spiritual counselor available on demand. She listened from her quiet room and responded with words shaped by years of silence. She was enclosed, yet exposed, hidden, yet deeply visible. From this tiny cell, Julian spent decades reflecting on a series of intense spiritual visions she experienced during a grave illness when she was 30 years old. She wrote or dictated these reflections, which became Revelations of Divine Love. This is a massive historical milestone. It is the first known book ever written in English by a woman. It is astonishing to consider the scale of this achievement. Think about the context. This was the era of the Black Death. The plague was ravaging Europe, killing roughly half the population. Death was everywhere. Fear was the dominant emotion of the century. And yet, by narrowing her physical world to just a few square feet, she expanded her inner world beyond measure. Her cell became not a cage, but a lens. By removing all other distractions, she focused her attention until her insight became sharp, clear, and revolutionary.
From that depth came a sentence that has echoed across 600 years, showing up in everything from T.S. Eliot poems to modern self-help books. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Now, in our modern age of Instagram quotes and good vibes only, this might sound toxic positivity, but it isn't. These words were not born from a place of denial or privilege. They were born out of silence, illness, confinement, and the context of a plague-ridden world. Julian looked the suffering of the world in the face, through her window and in her own heart, and she didn't blink. She sat with the pain. When she says all shall be well, she isn't saying, don't worry, nothing bad will happen. She is saying that ultimately, meaning and love are stronger than chaos. It is the quiet authority of someone who has survived the darkness and returned with a light. Julian understood solitude not as abandonment, but as a divine gift. In stillness, she discovered a faith so steady that it could hold others up when they were collapsing. Her room did not shrink her spirit, it gave it room to breathe. It is important to notice that her solitude was not bleak. There was light, there was listening, there was relationship even through stone walls. Through her small window, Julian built what we might call an invisible society, a community of minds and hearts connected not by physical proximity, but by deep presence. She proved that you don't need to be at every party to be a vital part of your community. And so this chapter leaves us with a quiet paradox to chew on. Julian was physically confined to a space smaller than most of our bedrooms, but inwardly she was vast. She was declared dead to the world, yet she spent her life offering words that continue to comfort the living centuries after she died. Her solitude reminds us that being alone does not mean being cut off. We often confuse the two. We think solitude means isolation, but Julian shows us that sometimes, when held with care and intention, solitude becomes a womb rather than a wall. It becomes a place where insight grows, and where in the deepest quiet, a gentle truth can emerge and endure, whispering to us even now, all shall be well.
Chapter 8. Climbing for Clarity. Petrarch on Mont Ventoux.
As we move forward in time, something subtle but seismic begins to change in the atmosphere. We are still firmly planted in a world of faith, God, and inherited traditions. This is the 14th century, after all. But a new kind of curiosity is stirring. It's a curiosity not just about heaven and hell, but about the human self. It's a shift from wondering what the world means theologically to wondering what it feels like to actually experience it. This is the very beginning of the Renaissance, the dawn of humanism, and this shift is often symbolized by a single specific climb. The date is April 26, 1336. We are in the region of Provence, France. The mountain looming before us is Mont Ventoux, the windy mountain. It's tall, broad, and rises gently but persistently above the landscape. And standing at the base, looking up, is a young Italian poet named Francesco Petrarca, known to history simply as Petrarch. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand how strange it was. In 1336, people didn't really climb mountains for fun. Mountains were viewed as dangerous, useless obstacles. You crossed them if you had to, for war, for trade, or to get to the other side to survive. But Petrarch isn't a soldier, a merchant, or a refugee. He is climbing simply because he wants to. He wants to see what the view looks like from the top. He is, in a way, the first modern tourist. And, perhaps without fully realizing it yet, he is climbing because he wants to see what happens inside his own head when he steps out of his comfort zone. Petrarch does not climb alone. He brings his brother, Gherardo, along for the trip. And almost immediately, the two brothers reveal two completely different ways of moving through life. Gerardo is the type of person who just gets things done. He's disciplined, direct, and practical. He chooses the steep vertical route straight up the ridge. It's demanding, it burns the calves, and it's uncomfortable, but it is clear. Petrarch, on the other hand, represents the procrastinator in all of us. He keeps looking for an easier way. He wanders into the valleys, zigzagging around, hoping to find a gentler ascent that doesn't require so much sweating. The result is exactly what you'd expect. While Gerardo makes steady progress, Petrarch gets lost. He wanders lower and lower, wasting energy, only to realize that the easy way doesn't exist. He has to scramble back up to find the ridge anyway, tired and frustrated. Much later, Petrarch would write about this and recognize the heavy symbolism of the moment. His physical wandering was a perfect mirror of his inner spiritual life. He had often sought the easier pleasures of the world, fame, romance, comfort, trying to avoid the steep, hard climb of virtue and self-discipline. He was looking for a shortcut to a meaningful life, but the mountain, quietly and patiently, was teaching him that shortcuts usually just lead to longer journeys. Eventually, sweating and breathless, they reached the summit. The experience is visceral. The wind is strong, living up to the mountain's name. The air is thin and cold. Clouds drift below their feet like a soft moving sea, cutting them off from the world below. In the distance, the snow-capped Alps shine faintly against the horizon. The view is vast, almost overwhelming. Petrarch himself described it as dizzying, a moment of physical awe that suspended his normal thinking. But the most important moment of this trip doesn't come from the landscape, it comes from a book. Petrarch reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small, familiar companion that he carried everywhere, a pocket-sized copy of Confessions by St. Augustine. This was his version of a smartphone, his source of information and comfort. Without planning, he decides to play a game common in the Middle Ages. He opens the book at random, trusting that fate will show him what he needs to read. His eyes fall on a single devastating line. Men go about to wonder at the heights of mountains, and the mighty waves of the sea, and the wide sweep of rivers, and the vast circuit of the ocean, and the revolutions of the stars, but themselves they consider not. Petrarch freezes. You can imagine the color draining from his face. The coincidence strikes him with the force of a physical blow. It feels like a cosmic prank. Here he is, standing on a mountain, feeling proud of himself for marveling at creation, for being a modern man appreciating nature. And then a voice from 1,000 years earlier reaches out and gently slaps him in the face. It accuses him of missing the point entirely. Augustine was telling him, you are looking out when you should be looking in. At that moment, the magnificent view becomes secondary. Petrarch falls silent. The mountain no longer needs commentary. The view no longer asks for poetry. He closes the book, turns inward, and begins his descent without speaking a word to Gerardo. Later, he would write that he spent the entire walk down reflecting on the vanity of human wishes. He realized he had traveled miles to see a pile of rock and dirt, but he had spent very little time exploring the landscape of his own soul. The climb wasn't meaningless, far from it, but its meaning wasn't the view. The climb was a catalyst. It revealed that the true summit was not beneath his feet, it was within his spirit. After that day, Petrarch confessed he had nothing more to say until he reached the bottom. This is why the climb of Mont Ventoux is often seen as a turning point in Western history. It didn't reject faith. Petrarch was still a deeply religious man, but it added something new to the mix: self-examination. It gave birth to the idea that nature can be a mirror.
It showed us that an outer journey, a hike, a pilgrimage, or just a long walk in the local park to clear our heads, we think we are going to see the world, but if we are lucky, like Petrarch, we end up seeing ourselves. And this is the quiet, enduring lesson Petrarch leaves behind. Solitude does not always require sitting still in a room. Sometimes solitude arrives in motion. It comes in the rhythm of breath and fatigue. It comes when your legs are burning and the air is cold. But when it arrives, it asks us the same question Augustine asked Petrarch. Are you just looking at the scenery, or are you looking at who is doing the seeing? The higher we climb, the more the world opens up, and if we are attentive, the more our inner landscape reveals itself too. In that sense, Mont Ventoux was not just a mountain, it was a mirror, and in its stillness, Petrarch finally saw himself.
Chapter 9. Your Mind's Secret Back Room. Montaigne.
Now we travel to 16th century France, specifically to the lush, rolling countryside of the Dordogne region. It's a place of vineyards, rivers, and chateaux, but we are interested in one estate in particular. At the edge of the main house stands a stone tower, round and solid, rising just high enough to feel separate from the daily grind of domestic life. This is the famous tower of Michel de Montaigne, a nobleman who decided at the age of 38 that he had had enough of the rat race of court life and legal work. He retired here not to hide, but to find himself. Inside this circular room, there is a small circular room where something quietly modern began to take shape. If you climb the narrow, winding stone steps, you enter his library. It's a modest but carefully arranged space, curved to fit the walls, with a desk, a chair, and shelves lined with leather-bound books. Light enters softly through 3 windows, offering different views of the estate. But the most interesting detail is right above your head. On the wooden beams of the ceiling, Montaigne had dozens of short sentences carved and burned into the wood. These weren't inspirational quotes telling him to hustle or dream big. They were skeptical, grounding quotations in Greek and Latin, reminders of ancient wisdom, but mostly reminders of human limitation. One famously asked, "Que sais-je?" or "What do I know?" Montaigne liked to look up at them while he paced and thought, letting them gently puncture any illusion of certainty or arrogance he might be feeling. From one of his windows, Montaigne could look down and see his land, his garden, his workers, and the bustling life he was responsible for. He could see the world that demanded things from him. But inside this tower, he was something else entirely. Here, he was not a landlord worrying about crops. He was not a public official or the mayor of Bordeaux, a role he later held. He wasn't even a husband, a father, or a friend. Here, he was simply himself. It is in this protected space that Montaigne wrote his essays. And essays is a key word here. In French, essayer means to try. He wasn't writing formal philosophy, he was trying out his thoughts on paper. These texts feel less like a university lecture and more like an extended, honest conversation with a very smart, very funny friend. And from this room came one of his most enduring and practical ideas, the arrière-boutique, or the back shop of the mind. To understand this, you have to picture a shop in Montaigne's time. The front of the shop was a public space. People entered, money changed hands, goods were sold, and roles were performed. You had to smile, be polite, and play the part of the merchant. But behind the shop there was often a small private room, a back shop. This was a place where the shopkeeper could step away, take off the mask, loosen his collar, and just breathe. It was a space that the customers never saw.
Montaigne believed that every single person needs such a place within their own psychology. He argued that we must reserve a back shop that belongs to no one else, not our spouses, not our children, and certainly not our employers. It is a space entirely free, where true liberty can exist. In the modern world, this is a radical concept. We are constantly in the front shop. We are performing on social media, performing at work, and performing in our relationships. We are always accessible, always notifying, always reacting. Montaigne is telling us to build a mental wall where those demands cannot follow. Crucially, this back shop is not an escape from life. Montaigne was not suggesting we should all become monks or hermits. He participated fully in the world. He was a diplomat, he managed his estate, he entertained guests, and he loved conversation. He didn't hate people. But he insisted that something must be kept in reserve. A part of the soul must remain uncompromised. This is a place where you can speak to yourself honestly, where you can laugh at your own absurdities, reflect on your mistakes without shame, and even entertain yourself with your own imagination. Montaigne believed this inner retreat was essential because life is fundamentally uncertain. Relationships end, people die, jobs are lost, possessions disappear. If your entire identity is tied up in the front shop, in your role as a parent, a CEO, or a partner, then when those roles fall away, you are left with nothing. The loss feels total, because there is no you left beneath the title. But if you have cultivated this back shop, then even in the face of devastating loss, something remains intact. You still belong to yourself.
This idea feels remarkably modern, almost like a precursor to the idea of mental resilience. Montaigne understood that we can borrow knowledge from others endlessly. We can read all the books and scroll all the feeds, but wisdom cannot be outsourced. We can repeat what others have said, but understanding only grows when we sit alone with our own thoughts and test them gently, patiently, in private. What makes Montaigne so lovable is that he wasn't severe about this. He didn't demand iron discipline or ascetic self-denial. His tone, even across 5 centuries, feels warm, human, and forgiving. He sounds like a wise, slightly eccentric uncle pouring you a glass of wine and reminding you not to give all of yourself away to the world. He tells stories about playing with his cat and wondering if the cat is actually playing with him. He writes about his food preferences and his kidney stones. He is grounded in reality. This idea feels remarkably modern, almost like a precursor to the idea of mental resilience. Montaigne understood that we can borrow knowledge from others endlessly. We can read all the books and scroll all the feeds, but wisdom cannot be outsourced. We can repeat what others have said, but understanding only grows when we sit alone with our own thoughts and test them gently, patiently, in private. What makes Montaigne so lovable is that he wasn't severe about this. He didn't demand iron discipline or ascetic self-denial. His tone, even across 5 centuries, feels warm, human, and forgiving. He sounds like a wise, slightly eccentric uncle pouring you a glass of wine and reminding you not to give all of yourself away to the world. He tells stories about playing with his cat and wondering if the cat is actually playing with him. He writes about his food preferences and his kidney stones. He is grounded in reality. His message is simple. Keep something back. Not out of fear or selfishness, but out of care. Solitude, for Montaigne, is not a heroic withdrawal like the Rhinoceros, nor a spiritual ordeal like the anchorite. It is a form of maintenance. It is a way of renewing your judgment so you don't get swept away by the mob. It is a place where the mind stretches and relaxes at the same time. In that small round room in the Dordogne, he discovered a quiet kind of sovereignty. It wasn't power over others. He didn't care much for that. It was authority over himself. And as we leave the tower and step back into our noisy, connected world, his lesson follows us gently. You may live among others. You may serve, love, work, and participate fully in the chaos of society. But somewhere inside, you must keep a back shop, a room with the door closed, a place where you can return again and again to remember who you are when no one is watching and nothing is required of you.
Chapter 10. Cozy by the Stove. Descartes' Deep Thoughts.
Now we move into the early 17th century, specifically to the winter of 1619. We are in the heart of Europe, and the continent is gripping the edge of what would become the 30 Years' War. Outside, the world is locked in ice. Snow covers the ground in thick, unbroken sheets, and the air is sharp enough to sting your lungs. Movement itself feels like a massive effort. Somewhere in southern Germany, in the town of Neuburg an der Donau, a young soldier is waiting for the season and the military campaigns to pass. His name is René Descartes. At this point in his life, he isn't the father of modern philosophy yet. He is a 23-year-old mercenary, a traveler, moving from place to place, living in a world defined by political chaos and religious violence. To escape the biting cold, he retreats into a small, enclosed room heated by a masonry stove, what he called a pole. Now, there's often a translation error here where people imagine Descartes sitting inside a stove. He wasn't baking himself. He was in a room heated by a massive ceramic heater that radiated a dry, intense warmth long after the fire had died down. Inside, the contrast is striking. Beyond the walls, winter and war dominate everything. It is a world of mud, freezing metal, and shouting men. But inside this room, the heat is steady, the air is still, the silence is complete. It acts almost like a sensory deprivation tank. Descartes later recalls that he had no conversation to distract him, and, just as importantly, no pressing worries or passions to trouble his mind. The world, for a brief, magical window of time, leaves him completely alone. In that quiet heat, something radical begins to happen. With nothing external demanding his attention, no smartphone, no commanding officer, no social obligations, Descartes turns inward. He doesn't just daydream, he begins a rigorous mental demolition project. He decides to examine everything he has ever believed to be true. Slowly, deliberately, he starts to dismantle his assumptions, like someone checking a basket of apples for rot. He decides that if even one apple is rotten, he has to dump the whole basket to find the good ones. He doubts the testimony of his senses. After all, our eyes can be tricked by distance or water. He questions the existence of the physical world. How do we know we aren't hallucinating? He even entertains the terrifying possibility that his own body might be an illusion, or that an evil demon is deceiving him about reality. This isn't depression or despair. It is a method. It is a deliberate intellectual exercise. The room becomes a furnace of the mind. It is a place where beliefs are heated up until only the things that cannot be destroyed remain. In this solitude, Descartes experiences a series of vivid, almost feverish dreams, known as the night of fire, that convince him he has stumbled onto something vital. He realizes he is standing at the threshold of a completely new way of thinking. As everything else falls away, the physical world, the senses, the past, one truth remains stubbornly intact. Even if he doubts everything, he cannot doubt that he is doubting. The act of doubting requires a doubter. There must be a self doing the thinking.
And so, sitting in that toasty room, he arrives at the sentence that would become the most famous slogan in Western philosophy: cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. In that moment, a massive shift occurs. Existence is no longer grounded in tradition, in the authority of the church, or in what your parents told you. It is grounded in consciousness itself. The thinking mind becomes the bedrock foundation upon which all other knowledge can be rebuilt. This is the birth of the modern self, the idea that the individual mind is the center of the universe. Descartes would later reflect on this experience and note that truth is often discovered more clearly by a single person working alone than by a group bound together by habit or compromise. He used the analogy of architecture. Buildings designed by a single architect are usually more beautiful and functional than cities that grew randomly over time, or projects designed by a committee. He observed that works shaped by many hands often contain less coherence than those shaped by one mind following a single rigorous method. This is a powerful critique of groupthink. In our modern world, we are obsessed with collaboration, brainstorming sessions, and open-plan offices. We think more heads are always better. But Descartes suggests that for the deepest, most structural kind of thinking, you need to be alone. You need to shut the door. This is solitude not as comfort, but as courage. Here, being alone is not about rest, self-care, or restoration. It is about daring to strip away social consensus. It's about taking a hard look at the inherited opinions you hold, political, religious, personal, and asking, do I actually believe this, or did I just absorb it from the crowd? It is about standing face to face with uncertainty and refusing to look away until you find the truth. In that warm room, Descartes is not escaping the world to hide from it. He is rebuilding it from the ground up. The image lingers quietly, a single chair near the masonry stove, firewood stacked nearby, the orange glow of flames flickering against the plaster wall. A young man sits in stillness, listening not to the voices of his commanders or the rumors of the town, but to the whisper of reason itself. This chapter reminds us that solitude can be a laboratory. It is a place where ideas are tested under pressure. It is where illusions are burned away. It is where the mind, freed from the constant noise of agreement and notification, reaches down to the bedrock of reality. And sometimes, history shows us, it is only in the silence of a locked room on a frozen winter's day that a new way of seeing the world can truly begin.
Chapter 11. Why We Can't Just Sit Still. Pascal. After the fierce, high-heat intellectual furnace of Descartes, our journey turns inward again, venturing into much more fragile territory. We are still in 17th century France, but the mood has shifted completely. The sharp, mathematical confidence of reason gives way to something more uneasy, more messy, and deeply personal. Here we meet Blaise Pascal. He was a prodigy, a brilliant mathematician who invented the mechanical calculator, but he was also a man of deep religious conviction and an unusually sensitive observer of the human heart. Pascal once wrote a sentence so piercing that it still unsettles readers today, mostly because it feels like he is reading our diaries. He said that all of humanity's problems come from one simple source: our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. At first glance, that claim sounds wildly exaggerated, maybe even a little dramatic. Surely suffering comes from war, illness, poverty, injustice, or just plain bad luck. Pascal wasn't denying those physical realities. He was pointing to something beneath them, a psychological engine that drives our worst behaviors. He was arguing that wars, conflicts, and reckless ambitions often start because people cannot bear to be at peace with themselves. They need chaos outside to drown out the silence inside.
Pascal watched the world around him with the eye of a sociologist. He saw the French court buzzing with frantic activity. He saw nobles obsessed with hunting, gambling, and endless balls. He saw merchants and officials filling every spare moment with noise and movement. And he noticed something strange. None of this activity seemed aimed at genuine happiness. It was aimed at distraction.
Pascal called this divertissement, diversion. He didn't mean entertainment in the joyful sense, like laughing at a joke or enjoying a play. He meant constant motion designed to keep the mind occupied so it doesn't have to look in the mirror. He used the example of hunting, which was huge in his time. He pointed out that if you went up to a hunter and simply gave him the hare, handed him the dead rabbit and said, "Here you go, now you don't have to go into the woods," he wouldn't be happy. In fact, he'd be insulted. Why? Because he doesn't actually want the rabbit. He wants the chase. He wants the suspense, the physical exertion, and the focus required to track the animal. He wants those things because as long as he is chasing the hare, he isn't thinking about his own life. Pascal suggested that people do not chase the hare because they want the prize. They chase it because standing still would force them to think. And for many of us, thinking is terrifying. Pascal believed that when human beings stop moving, when the distraction fades, something uncomfortable rises to the surface like oil in water. We begin to sense our own smallness. We feel the Sunday scaries on a cosmic scale. We start thinking about our ignorance, our mortality, and the fact that we don't fully understand who we are or why we are here. He called this inner awareness our wretchedness. He didn't mean this as an insult, but as a description of our vulnerability. The silence exposes us. It strips away our titles and our busywork and reminds us that we are finite creatures suspended between greatness and fragility. So, naturally, we flee. We run from that feeling as fast as we can. We fill the void with noise. We fill it with plans, errands, gossip, and unnecessary drama. We build entire lives around staying busy, wearing our exhaustion like a badge of honor. We do anything to keep from being alone with ourselves for too long. If Pascal were alive today, he wouldn't just recognize this pattern, he would see it amplified 1 billion times over. He would look at our relationship with technology and nod knowingly. He would see the glowing screen we carry in our pockets as the ultimate divertissement. He would see the reflex to check Instagram the second we step into an elevator. He would see us listening to podcasts at 2x speed while doing the dishes because we can't bear 5 minutes of our own thoughts. The technology is new, but the impulse is ancient. We are essentially hunting hares on our screens, scrolling endlessly to avoid the quiet. However, Pascal's message is not meant to shame us. He isn't trying to make us feel guilty for watching Netflix. He is trying to diagnose the problem gently so we can fix it. Pascal understood that solitude initially feels unbearable because it forces us to confront questions we would rather postpone. It acts like a mirror we've been avoiding. But he also believed that if we could endure that discomfort, if we could just sit in the chair and sweat through the first 20 minutes of restlessness, something else might emerge. He believed that beyond the boredom, beyond the twitchy desire to check your phone, and beyond the fear of being insignificant, there is a breakthrough. Pascal suggested that silence, once endured long enough, could open the door to something deeper. It leads to honesty, and through honesty we find the possibility of true meaning. For Pascal, that meaning ultimately pointed toward the divine. He believed that distraction keeps us from recognizing our spiritual need and our capacity for faith. Solitude, though bitter at first taste, becomes a kind of medicine. It isn't pleasant going down, but it heals the fracture in the soul. This chapter leaves us with a gentle, practical challenge. What happens if we do not flee the quiet? What if the next time you are waiting for a friend or sitting on a train, you don't pull out your phone? What if you just sit there? What if you allow the wave of boredom to wash over you without immediately trying to erase it? Pascal believed that peace does not come from endless stimulation or the next dopamine hit. It comes from the courage to remain still long enough to face ourselves, flaws and all. And perhaps in learning to sit quietly in that room, we do not lose ourselves at all. Perhaps we finally begin to find something real, something solid that no amount of noise could ever replace.
Chapter 12. Daydreaming on an Island. Rousseau's Bliss. As we move into the era known as the Age of Enlightenment, the intellectual lights get turned up to maximum brightness. This was the 18th century, a time when Europe was obsessed with reason, science, and progress. Cities like Paris and Geneva were buzzing with coffeehouses, salons, and arguments about the future of humanity. It was an exciting time, but it was also incredibly loud. And amidst all that noise and aggressive logic, one of the most influential thinkers of the era felt completely overwhelmed. His name was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. While his peers were leaning into the spotlight, Rousseau found himself desperately wanting to step out of it. By this point in his life, he was worn down. He was a controversial figure, often paranoid, dealing with conflict, censorship, and the exhausting feeling of being constantly misunderstood by the public. So, he did what many of us fantasize about doing when burnout hits. He ran away to an island. He retreated to the island of Saint Pierre, a tiny, isolated spot of land set gently in the middle of Lake Bienne in Switzerland. He only stayed there for about 2 months in the autumn of 1765, but he would later describe this brief window as the happiest time of his entire life. What makes this place special isn't grand luxury or dramatic landscapes. The island is modest, walkable, and intimate. For Rousseau, it became the ultimate refuge from a society that felt relentlessly judgmental. At the heart of his days on the island was a simple, repetitive ritual. Almost every afternoon, weather permitting, Rousseau would hop into a small rowboat and paddle out onto the lake. But he wasn't exercising, and he wasn't trying to get to the other side. When he reached the center, far enough from the shore that he couldn't hear anyone talking, he would pull the oars in. He would lie flat on his back in the bottom of the boat, look up at the sky, and do absolutely nothing. He let the boat drift. Just picture that for a second. The water lapping softly against the wood, the boat spinning slowly in the current, the light shifting across the surface of the lake. For hours, Rousseau allowed himself to float without direction, without purpose, and without an itinerary. In a world that demanded he be a great thinker, he gave himself permission to just be a body in a boat. This act of drifting wasn't just laziness, it was the physical expression of a deep philosophical idea Rousseau called the sentiment of existence. This is the pure, unadulterated feeling of simply being alive. Rousseau argued that in our ordinary social lives, we almost never experience this. We live in memory, regretting the past, or in anticipation, worrying about the future. We measure ourselves against our neighbors. We stress about our to-do lists. Ambition and anxiety are constantly pulling the mind away from the present moment.
But out there, suspended on the water, all of that faded away. There was no striving. There was no comparison. There was no audience to impress. There was only the quiet, rhythmic awareness of existing. In these moments, Rousseau writes that he felt totally complete. He even dared to say that he felt self-sufficient, like God. He didn't mean this in an arrogant, power-hungry way. He meant it in the sense of wholeness. He realized that in that state of deep solitude, nothing was missing. Nothing was required from the outside world to make him happy. He didn't need to become anything else. He was enough, just as he was. This is a very different kind of solitude than what we've seen in previous chapters. It isn't the tense, disciplined solitude of the Stoics or the religious solitude of the monks. It is gentle, almost playful. It is a form of radical rest that allows the soul to settle into what Rousseau calls the eternal now. It's the feeling you might get today when you're floating in a swimming pool, ears underwater, world muffled, just looking at the sun through your eyelids. Alongside these hours of drifting, Rousseau developed another small practice that helped anchor his solitude. He became obsessed with botany. He decided he was going to catalog every single plant on the island. He would spend hours bending close to the ground, armed with a magnifying glass, studying the intricate structures of leaves, stems, and petals. This focus on minute details gave him a sense of control and calm, especially during a time when he felt persecuted by the larger world. This is what we might call micro-solitude. It's a narrowing of attention that paradoxically creates freedom. By focusing entirely on the veins of a single leaf, Rousseau escaped the weight of his reputation and his worries. It's similar to how modern people find peace in knitting, building Lego sets, or baking sourdough bread. It's a way of getting out of your head and into your hands. There is something deeply tender and relatable in this image. Here is a man remembered for grand political theories and intense emotional writings, yet he finds peace not through winning an argument, but through stillness. He finds it not through achievement, but through drifting. He finds it by allowing his thought process to soften into simple awareness. Rousseau's island becomes a lullaby made of water and light. It is a place where nothing urgent happens, and where wasting time turns out to be the best use of time. As this chapter gently closes, the image remains with us. A small wooden boat, a quiet gray-blue lake, a man lying still, gazing upward at the clouds. In that floating pause, Rousseau discovers something many of us forget in our hustle culture world. He teaches us that sometimes the deepest contentment comes not from shaping the world or fighting the current, but from pulling in the oars and letting ourselves drift within it. And that in moments of true solitude, doing nothing at all can mean experiencing everything.
Chapter 13. Finding Joy in Alone Time. Wordsworth.
As we step into the Romantic era, the tone of our journey shifts significantly. We are leaving behind the intense, razor-sharp logic of the Enlightenment and moving into a world that values emotion over calculation. Reason gives way to feeling, structure gives way to memory, and the concept of solitude transforms yet again. It is no longer a fortress to be defended like Marcus Aurelius, or a discipline to be mastered like the monks. Instead, it becomes something gentler, something tender, something quietly joyful. To understand this shift, we need to visit the Lake District of England. Imagine a rugged, wet, beautiful landscape of rolling hills and dark water. Walking through this landscape are two figures, the poet William Wordsworth and his sister, Dorothy. It is April 15, 1802. The weather is classic English unsettled. A storm is threatening, the sky is gray, and a fierce wind is ripping across the surface of the lake near Glencoyne Bay. The air feels restless and alive. As the siblings walk, they stumble upon something remarkable. Along the edge of the lake stretches a massive, endless belt of daffodils. We aren't talking about a polite little garden patch here. We are talking about thousands of them. A host, as Wordsworth would later call them. They are moving with the wind, swaying, leaning, and rising again in a way that makes them look like a crowd of people at a concert. Dorothy records the moment in her journal with an eye for detail that feels immediate and physical. She writes that the flowers tossed and reeled and danced, and that they seemed to laugh with the wind. Her words capture the raw sensory input of the moment before it has been shaped into art. There is a crucial detail here that often gets lost because of the poem's famous title. Despite writing, "I wandered lonely as a cloud," William Wordsworth was not alone when he saw the daffodils. The experience itself was social. It was shared. It happened in motion, in conversation, and in the open air with his favorite person. He didn't need to be solitary to have the experience. The solitude comes later, much later. In the poem, Wordsworth describes a totally different scene from the one by the lake. He is no longer walking in the wind. He is lying on his couch, indoors, removed from the weather and the world. He is, as he puts it, in a vacant or pensive mood. In modern terms, he's zoning out. He isn't busy, he isn't distracted by a phone or a book, he isn't stimulated, he is just being. And it is in that specific stillness, that boredom really, that the daffodils return. He sees them again, not with his physical eyes, but with what he famously calls the inward eye. The memory rises gently, unforced, filling the quiet, empty space of his mind. And as the image of the dancing flowers returns, his heart fills with pleasure. That specific moment of playback, he writes, is the bliss of solitude. This is the subtle but profound insight Wordsworth offers us, and it changes how we think about memory. Solitude isn't always about the act of gathering experiences. Often the gathering happens with others, at a dinner party, on a hike, at a wedding. But solitude is the place where those experiences are understood, absorbed, and transformed. It is the place where raw data becomes personal meaning. You can think of it like photography. Wordsworth shows us that solitude functions like a developing room or a dark room. The images of the world are captured out there in the bright light and the chaos of movement, but they are developed in here, in the darkness and stillness of the mind. Without that quiet processing time, even the most beautiful experiences can pass right through us like water through a sieve, leaving no warmth behind. In our modern world, we often skip this step. We take a photo of a sunset or a concert, post it to Instagram, and think we have captured the memory. But often we have just offloaded it to a server. We rarely sit on the couch, staring at a blank wall, letting the memory resurface on its own. We rarely give ourselves the vacant mood necessary for the playback to start. The joy Wordsworth feels on his couch is not lesser than the joy of the walk. In fact, he suggests it might be better. It is different, deeper, and lasting. It doesn't depend on the weather being nice or his legs being strong enough to hike. It arises entirely from within. This kind of solitude isn't lonely or isolating. It is companionable in its own way. The mind becomes a theater where memory, emotion, and imagination meet. It is a place where our shared moments are returned to us, enriched by time and reflection. Wordsworth reminds us that happiness doesn't always happen at the exact moment something beautiful occurs. Sometimes there's a lag time. Sometimes the joy arrives on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 3 years later, when we are finally still enough to receive it. So, this chapter closes with a gentle reassurance for those of us who fear missing out. You do not have to be alone to gather joy. Go out, see your friends, walk in the crowds. But you often need solitude to feel that joy fully. And sometimes, lying quietly with absolutely nothing to do, the happiest company we keep is not another person at all. It is the soft return of something once seen, now glowing quietly within the inward eye.
Chapter 14. Chatting with Trees, Beethoven's Walks. Now we move into the early 19th century, transporting ourselves to the rolling, wooded countryside surrounding Vienna. The city is nearby, bustling with imperial politics and high society, but in this chapter, we rarely see it.
Instead, we are following a solitary, somewhat disheveled figure moving steadily along dirt paths. He is out there from early morning until the light begins to fade, tramping through fields and groves with a singular intensity. This is Ludwig van Beethoven. And to understand his solitude, you have to understand the tragedy unfolding inside his head. By this time in his life, something devastating is happening. His hearing is fading. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing slide into silence, accompanied by a constant, maddening ringing in his ears. For a musician, this is the ultimate nightmare, like a painter going blind or a chef losing their sense of taste. Gradually, painfully, the world of human voices, music, and conversation is slipping away from him. Sounds that once defined his life are becoming distant, unreliable, and distorted. But here is the fascinating twist. As the human world goes quiet, something else grows louder. Beethoven begins to walk obsessively. We aren't talking about a leisurely Sunday stroll to burn off brunch. We are talking about rigorous, athletic, all-day treks. Day after day, he leaves the city walls behind and heads into the Vienna woods. He tramps through bushes and tall grass, ducks under low-hanging branches, and scrambles across rocky ground. He doesn't dress for the occasion either. His clothes grow dusty and stained. His hair, famously wild, gets blown about by the wind. To an outsider, he must have looked completely unhinged. He gestures constantly while he walks, his arms cutting through the air as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra. Sometimes he shouts out a melody. Sometimes he hums a bass line in a growling voice. And often he suddenly stops dead in his tracks, pulls out one of the small pocket sketchbooks he always carries, and scribbles furiously. These sketchbooks were his lifeline. Because he couldn't trust his memory or his ears, he had to capture the musical ideas the second they arrived. He was like a modern creative who was constantly recording voice memos or frantically typing into the Notes app on their phone before an idea evaporates. If you were a local farmer seeing this man stomping through your field, shouting at the sky, you would probably cross the street to avoid him. And to be fair, Beethoven was retreating from people. His deafness built a wall between him and society. Conversation became exhausting. He had to lean in, ask people to repeat themselves, or eventually rely on written conversation books. Social gatherings weren't fun anymore. They were painful reminders of what he was losing. He isolated himself not because he hated people. He actually longed for connection, but because the mechanics of connecting had become humiliating. But that same wall acted like a lens. It focused his attention completely on his inner world and on nature itself. Beethoven once wrote a letter describing how deeply happy he felt wandering among bushes, herbs, trees, and rocks. He insisted that no one can love the countryside as much as I do. These walks were not just leisure or exercise, they were a necessity. They were the only place where his mind could breathe without the anxiety of trying to hear a spoken word. As human sound faded, nature became his confidant. For Beethoven, the natural world was not silent. It was expressive. It was alive. He famously wrote that in the country, every tree seemed to speak to him, calling out, "Holy, holy." It sounds a bit psychedelic, but he meant it. Rocks, woods, and hills, he believed, sent back the echo that human beings long for. This wasn't just poetic exaggeration. It reflects how deeply he experienced sound internally, even as his physical ears failed him. Nature became a resonating chamber for his imagination. Streams didn't just flow, they murmured in specific keys. Leaves didn't just rustle, they whispered rhythms. Birds traced melodic patterns in the air. Thunder wasn't just noise, it was a percussion section he could feel vibrating in his chest. All of this poured directly into his work. If you listen to his pastoral symphony, the sixth, you are essentially reading a musical diary of these walks. It is program music, music that tells a specific story. You can hear the brook flowing in the string section. You can recognize specific bird calls, the nightingale, the quail, and the cuckoo woven into the woodwinds. You can feel the tension of an approaching storm, the violence of the thunder, and the sweet, relieved calm that follows it. This was not abstract composition done in a sterile studio. It was lived experience, translated into sound. Beethoven's Solitude was not chosen lightly. It was forced upon him by biology, but he chose what to do with it. Cut off from ordinary noise and gossip, he entered what some have called the spiritual monarchy of his art. In this realm, he answered to nothing but truth, feeling, and form. In this solitude, the woods were never empty. They were crowded with presence. The trees answered when people could not. The landscape spoke when society fell silent. Beethoven was alone, yes, but he was never without conversation. This chapter gently reframes our understanding of solitude once more. We often think of solitude as a lack of people, a lack of sound, a lack of activity. But Beethoven shows us that it's actually a shift in attention. Sometimes solitude is not the absence of sound, it's a change in who or what we are listening to. For Beethoven, when human voices faded, the hills replied. And in that quiet, intense exchange between a broken man and the natural world, music was born that still speaks to us today, long after the forest paths he walked have grown quiet again.
Chapter 15. Poodles, Porcupines, and Staying Solo. Schopenhauer. Now we arrive in 19th century Frankfurt, and the atmosphere shifts dramatically. We are leaving the romantic lakes and talking trees behind. The tone here is sharper, more skeptical, and definitely less sentimental. We are no longer drifting in a boat. We are sitting on a stiff city bench beside a man who has very little patience for illusion and even less for small talk. His name is Arthur Schopenhauer. If you met him at a dinner party, you probably wouldn't like him, and the feeling would be mutual. Schopenhauer had a reputation for being difficult, grumpy, and fiercely routine-oriented. He lived alone. He ate alone, dining every single day at the same hotel, the Englischer Hof, where he would pay for a double portion of food just to ensure no one sat next to him. He avoided social gatherings whenever possible. He once stated, with typical bluntness, that a high degree of intellect tends to make a person unsocial. This wasn't just shyness or social anxiety, it was a deep philosophical conviction. Schopenhauer believed that most human interaction was filled with pretense, competition, and subtle cruelty. He looked at a cocktail party and didn't see friends catching up. He saw egos battling for dominance. In his view, politeness was often just a thin, fragile cover over selfish motives. For someone who valued clarity and brutal honesty above all else, solitude was not a loss or a deprivation, it was a relief. It was the only time he didn't have to watch people lying to each other. Yet his life was not entirely without companionship. He just didn't find it in humans. He found it in dogs. Specifically, poodles. Over the course of his life, he owned a succession of white standard poodles. And here is a detail that tells you everything you need to know about his philosophy. He named them all Atman. Atman is a Sanskrit word meaning world soul or the true self. To Schopenhauer, individual personality was an illusion, but the life force within us was real. By naming every dog Atman, he was acknowledging that the spirit in the dog was the same timeless spirit, just in a new furry body. Schopenhauer walked his poodle every day along the river, speaking to it as though it were an intellectual equal. In fact, he trusted the animal's presence far more than human company. Why? Because the dog did not deceive.
The dog lived entirely in the present moment. It didn't try to flatter him to get alone. It didn't scheme behind his back. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. If the dog was happy, it wagged its tail. If it was angry, it growled. To Schopenhauer, this transparent honesty was infinitely more valuable than even the cleverest conversation with a person who was secretly judging you. Humans, he thought, were trapped in the world of appearances and masks. The dog was real. This brings us to one of his most famous and enduring images. It's a small parable that explains his philosophy of solitude better than any abstract academic argument. He called it the dilemma of porcupines. Imagine a group of porcupines on a freezing winter day. They are shivering and miserable. To survive, their instinct tells them to huddle together for warmth. But here is the problem. The closer they press against one another, the more they prick each other with their sharp, long quills. The intimacy brings immediate pain. It becomes unbearable. So they pull apart, scattering to stop the stabbing. But as soon as they separate, they start to freeze again. Back and forth they go, shuffling between the pain of freezing and the pain of being wounded. Eventually, they settle on a moderate distance. They find a spot where they are close enough to get a little bit of warmth, but far enough away that they don't get stabbed. Schopenhauer called this middle ground politeness or good manners. Schopenhauer believed this is exactly how human society works. We are driven together by the cold, which is boredom and the fear of being alone. We crave connection. But as soon as we get close, we encounter the quills. Other people's annoying habits, their bad moods, their egos, and their capacity to hurt us. Social life becomes a careful, exhausting dance of distance management. We maintain a polite gap to keep from getting hurt, which means we never get fully warm, but at least we don't bleed. But then Schopenhauer adds one more twist to the story, and this is where his defense of solitude really shines. He suggests that some porcupines have enough internal warmth of their own. These rare creatures do not need to huddle. They generate their own heat. For them, standing alone in the cold wind is preferable to being constantly pricked by the crowd. These are the solitary ones, the thinkers, the artists, the independent spirits, the ones who would rather endure a little loneliness than surrender their peace of mind to the chaos of the group. Schopenhauer did not say this to shame social people. He was simply stating what he saw as a law of thermodynamics for the soul. What matters most is what a person has in themselves. If your inner life is rich, if you have ideas, interests, creativity, and curiosity, you depend less on external stimulation. If your inner lamp burns brightly, you do not need to gather 100 other lamps around you just to see. Solitude, then, becomes a privilege. It is not a punishment for being weird. It is not a failure to be popular. It is a sign of inner sufficiency. It means you have enough fuel in your own tank to keep going without needing a push. Schopenhauer compared such people to eagles who build their nests high on rocky cliffs, far above the noise of the valley below. The height is not about arrogance or looking down on people, though Schopenhauer certainly did a bit of that. It's about necessity. From that height, the eagle sees clearly and remains undisturbed. This chapter quietly validates something many people feel but hesitate to admit in our hyper-social world. It tells us that it is okay to stay home on a Friday night. It is okay to prefer a quiet room to a loud concert. It is okay to choose depth over company. Schopenhauer does not promise happiness. He was a pessimist, after all. He rarely promised joy. But he offers something else, honesty and relief. He reminds us that solitude can be a refuge for those who carry enough warmth within themselves. And as we leave him there, walking slowly along the Frankfurt riverbank with his poodle, speaking softly to the only companion he fully trusts, one thought remains. Sometimes, keeping your distance isn't about loneliness at all. It's about self-respect. It's about knowing that you can survive the cold on your own.
Chapter 16. Diving into the Crowd. Kierkegaard's Human Bath.
Now we arrive in the middle of the 19th century, on the winding cobblestone streets of Copenhagen. The air is cool and damp. It is Denmark, after all. But the city itself is bustling. Carriages clatter past on the stones, shop windows glow softly with oil lamps, and the sound of chatter fills the squares. Weaving through this scene with quick, uneven steps is a man who looks a bit out of place. He's wearing a hat that seems slightly too big, gripping an umbrella tightly even if it isn't raining, and his eyes are darting around, alert and intensely curious. This is Søren Kierkegaard. And if you think of philosophers as people who hide in ivory towers or remote cabins to think deep thoughts, Kierkegaard is here to wreck that image. He is unmistakably a creature of the city. He doesn't flee from people to find solitude. He walks straight into the mob to find it. Every single day, Kierkegaard followed a ritual that would sound absolutely exhausting to an introvert. He would leave his home and spend hours power walking through the streets of Copenhagen. But he wasn't just getting his steps in, he was on a mission to interact. He struck up conversations with literally anyone he met. He didn't care about social hierarchy, he spoke with wealthy politicians, but he also chatted up maids, chimney sweeps, shopkeepers, and students. These weren't just nice weather we're having chats either. Kierkegaard was known for being witty, intense, and playful. He treated every interaction like a mini interview or a philosophical test run. Kierkegaard jokingly called this routine his human bath. It's a fantastic metaphor. Just as you might plunge your body into cold water to wake up your nerves, he plunged his mind into humanity to wake up his brain. He needed the noise, the gossip, the contradictions, and the energy of the crowd. He believed that thought needed friction to catch fire. Ideas didn't spring from a vacuum. They came alive when they were rubbed up against other minds. In a modern context, he's like that friend who can't work in a silent library, but is incredibly productive in a noisy coffee shop. He needed the background buzz of life to locate his own center. But, and this is the crucial part, the bath was never the end of the day. It was just the preparation. After soaking in the life of the streets until he was practically vibrating with energy, Kierkegaard would hurry home. Biographers describe him rushing back, often breathless, hat still on his head, diving straight for his writing desk. He used a tall, standing desk, and he would begin to write with frantic urgency. The words he had gathered on the street poured onto the page. The casual conversations were distilled into sharp philosophical questions. This was where his specific brand of solitude entered. For Kierkegaard, solitude wasn't about the absence of people. It was the silence that followed extreme engagement. The contrast was the whole point. The crowd gave his solitude its meaning, just as a glass of water tastes best after a long run in the heat. His thinking was dialectical, a fancy way of saying it relied on opposites. One state existed because of the other. Without the street, his quiet room would feel empty and stagnant, but without the quiet room, the street would just be noise. However, this delicate balance depended on something very fragile: anonymity. To make this system work, Kierkegaard needed to be in the crowd without being captured by it. He needed to be an observer, a spy in the service of God, as he sometimes called himself. He needed the freedom to engage when he wanted and withdraw when he was done. But that freedom was shattered during a painful episode known as the Corsair Affair. The Corsair was a satirical tabloid magazine in Copenhagen. Think of it as a 19th century version of TMZ or a vicious Twitter thread. They decided to target Kierkegaard. They mocked his writing, sure, but they mostly mocked him, his uneven trouser legs, his hunchback, his umbrella, his high-pitched voice. They published cartoons that turned him into a laughingstock. Suddenly, the dynamic of the human bath broke. People recognized him everywhere, but not with respect. Strangers laughed when he walked by. Street urchins followed him, mimicking his gait. Shopkeepers smirked. The streets no longer offered stimulation and data. They offered exposure and humiliation. The human bath became scalding hot. This forced Kierkegaard into a deeper, darker kind of isolation. It wasn't the chosen solitude of reflection anymore. It was the imposed solitude of the outcast. He couldn't be the anonymous observer because he was being observed too closely. This episode marked him deeply, and is one reason why his later writings turned so inward and intense. He lost his playground. But his story reveals something important about a certain kind of solitude that we often overlook. Not all solitude is rural. Not all solitude is silent. Kierkegaard is the patron saint of the urban loner. He speaks to the people who find their peace in busy cafes, on crowded subway platforms, or in the middle of a bustling park. These are the people who feel a sense of privacy precisely because there are so many people around them. For them, solitude is not about physical withdrawal. It is about a privacy of mind that happens in the midst of life. Kierkegaard speaks to those of us who feel most ourselves after leaving the party, not before entering it. He validates the experience of those who think best once the door closes, but only because it was open in the first place. As this chapter settles into gentle quiet, we are left with a gentle insight to carry with us. Solitude does not always begin with silence. Sometimes it begins with conversation, and sometimes the deepest quiet is not found in a cave far from people, but in that golden hour just after we have walked among them, listening closely, before turning the key in the lock to think alone.
Chapter 17. Life in a Simple Cabin. Thoreau at Walden. No journey through the history of solitude would feel complete without a quiet stop by a certain pond in New England. It is the cliché, the postcard, and the holy grail of American nature writing all rolled into one. But before we roll our eyes at the familiarity of it, let's actually step into the scene, because the reality is grittier and more interesting than the myth. It is the mid-19th century. The air around Concord, Massachusetts is clear and still, but the world nearby is changing fast. The Industrial Revolution is revving its engine. Trains are beginning to cut through the landscape, factories are springing up, and the pace of life is accelerating. Against this backdrop of noise and progress, a young man named Henry David Thoreau decides to hit the brakes. In 1845, he moves to the edge of Walden Pond, on land owned by his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson. He isn't there to escape life, he is there to corner it and see what it's actually made of. The cabin he builds is modest, almost to the point of humility. It's 10 feet by 15 feet, roughly the size of a modern master bedroom or a garden shed. It has shingled walls, a brick fireplace, and rough boards that Thoreau cut himself with a borrowed axe. He was meticulous about the economics of this experiment, famously noting that the total cost of materials was exactly $28.12.5. Inside, there is little more than the absolute necessities: a bed, a table, a desk, and 3 chairs. It was the original tiny house movement 170 years before hashtags existed. This simplicity wasn't about poverty, it was about intentionality. Thoreau wanted to strip away the clutter, to feel every detail of his days. He wanted to know the temperature of the air, the sound of rain on the roof, and the exact sensation of hunger arriving and leaving. He famously wrote that he went to the woods because he wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if he could learn what it had to teach him. He was terrified of the idea that he might come to die and discover that he had not lived. Some of his most profound moments of solitude happened at night. He describes rowing a boat out onto the middle of the pond under the moonlight. The water would be dark and smooth, with stars reflecting faintly on the surface like a second sky. Thoreau would drift without rowing, letting the wind or the current take the boat where it wanted. He would bring his flute and play softly into the night. The sound would carry over the water, thin and gentle, and somewhere below in the darkness, the fish would stir. As he fished in the dark, he would feel a faint tug on the line. It wasn't a violent pull, just a quiet connection, a vibration traveling up the string, linking him to something unseen beneath the surface. He describes this moment not as a conquest over nature, but as a communion with it. It was a reminder that he was just one part of a vast living depth he didn't fully understand. Walden is full of these small, almost mystical observations, including one very strange story that serves as a central metaphor for the whole book. One day, Thoreau notices a bug crawling out of an old applewood table in his cabin. The insect, a strong and beautiful bug, had apparently been an egg laid in the living tree years ago. It had survived the tree being chopped down, the wood being seasoned, and the table being built. It had slept inside the dead, dry wood for decades, only to finally be awakened by the heat of Thoreau's stove. For Thoreau, this wasn't just biology, it was hope. He saw it as a parable for the human spirit. If a spark of life can sleep inside dead wood for 60 years and still awaken, then perhaps human beings can also wake up. Perhaps we are all just hibernating under layers of habit, conformity, and social routine. Perhaps something alive is still moving inside us, just waiting for a little warmth and attention to break free. However, it is crucial to clear up the biggest misconception about Thoreau. People often picture him as a grumpy hermit who hated humanity. That isn't true. Thoreau was not hiding from people, and he wasn't hostile to society. In fact, he famously joked that he had 3 chairs in his house, 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, 3 for society. He didn't barricade himself in the woods. He walked into the village of Concord regularly, every day or two, to hear the gossip, argue about politics, get a good meal, and see his family. He could hear the train whistle from his cabin. His solitude was a base camp, not a bunker. Thoreau called this way of living deliberate. That is the key word. In the woods, away from the machinery and schedules of industrial life, he discovered how easily people drift into autopilot. We get busy, we fill our calendars, we buy things we don't need to impress people we don't like. Days turn into years without us ever really tasting them. Walden was his experiment in waking up from that trance. He did this not through total isolation, but through attention. He slowed down enough to notice the seasons changing. He paid attention to the war between red and black ants in his front yard. He measured the depth of the pond. Thoreau's lesson is gentle, but it hits hard. Solitude is not about disappearing from the world or becoming a survivalist. It is about meeting the world more honestly. By stepping back, even briefly, we gain the perspective needed to see how much of our lives are dictated by habit, and in seeing that, we are given a chance to choose differently. As this chapter settles into quiet, the image remains with us. A small, shingled cabin, a still pond reflecting the pines, a man sitting in a doorway, listening closely to the world. Thoreau reminds us that being alone can be an act of clarity. It is a way of remembering that life is not something to rush through, but something to wake up inside. And sometimes the simplest place, a room, a park bench, or a cabin, is exactly where that awakening begins.
Chapter 18. Rocking the White Dress. Emily Dickinson. We arrive now at a quiet, yellow brick house in Amherst, Massachusetts. If you walked past it today, you might miss the significance entirely. The streets outside are ordinary. People pass by on their way to work. The seasons change from humid summers to freezing winters, and life moves on much as it always does. But inside the homestead, up a narrow staircase, there is a bedroom where a different kind of journey took place, one that didn't require a passport or a ship. This is the domain of Emily Dickinson. For over a century, history has painted Dickinson as a tragic figure. We often hear her described as a recluse, a spinster, or a fragile woman who withdrew from the world out of fear or mental instability. It's the image of the mad woman in the attic. But this chapter wants to gently set that myth aside and look at the reality. What we find in this room is not absence, vacancy, or fear. What we find is supreme concentration. It wasn't an escape from reality. It was an intense, deliberate deep dive into it. Think of her not as a hermit hiding away, but as an artist who locked the studio door to get some serious work done. In her later years, Emily made a sartorial choice that has baffled and fascinated biographers ever since. She wore white almost exclusively. Imagine a simple white cotton dress with pockets, day after day, season after season. She rocked this look with total commitment. No one knows exactly why. Some scholars have suggested it was a sign of religious consecration, like a nun's habit without the convent. Others see it as a human choice in an era of dirty streets. But a more modern reading suggests it was a personal symbol, a refusal to participate in the exhausting cycle of fashion and social expectations. In a way, she was the original minimalist. It reminds you of Steve Jobs with his black turtlenecks or Mark Zuckerberg with his gray t-shirts. By wearing the same thing every day, she eliminated decision fatigue. The white dress became part of her private language. It was quiet, deliberate, and it didn't ask to be explained. It said, "I have more important things to think about than my outfit." Her room reflects the same disciplined restraint. A small cherry writing desk, tiny by modern standards, only about 17 inches square, sits near the window. On it, papers are folded carefully. Poems are written in pencil, sometimes on standard paper, sometimes on the backs of envelopes or scraps of junk mail, and then stitched together with thread into small handmade booklets called fascicles. The window looks out onto Main Street. It was close enough that she could hear the circus parade when it came to town, or see funerals passing by, but far enough away that she remained untouched by them. And crucially, there is a door that locks. This door matters more than the furniture. Dickinson was not cut off from the world in the way legends suggest. She wasn't ignorant. She wrote hundreds of passionate, funny, and brilliant letters to friends and literary mentors. She followed current events and read the newspaper religiously. She loved deeply. But she needed to manage the terms of contact. Her sensitivity was intense, almost raw. She was like a high-precision instrument that picks up every vibration. Too much exposure, too much small talk, or too much social noise could overwhelm the delicate machinery of her attention. There is a small, telling story that captures this dynamic perfectly. It's the ultimate introvert anecdote. From her bedroom window, Dickinson would sometimes lower a basket on a string into the garden below. Inside the basket, she would place fresh gingerbread, cookies, or small flowers for the neighborhood children playing in the yard. She would wait until the basket reached the ground, let the kids grab the treats, and then pull it back up again, all while staying out of sight so they wouldn't look up and see her. It is a tender, complicated image. She wanted to give. She wanted to connect. She wanted to be part of the joy of those children, but she also needed distance. She couldn't handle the energy drain of face-to-face interaction, so she engineered a way to be generous without being depleted.
This wasn't coldness, it was extreme self-care. It was a way of protecting what was most vulnerable in her, while still remaining kind. Inside that room, Dickinson traveled astonishing distances. She once wrote a poem that starts with the famous line, "The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door." In these lines, solitude is not rejection, it is a high-level curation, it is choice. The soul chooses what it can bear, what it can trust, maybe one or two people, maybe just God, maybe just the muse, and then closes the door not out of fear, but out of devotion to that choice. By remaining physically still, Dickinson moved inward at the speed of light. She explored grief, joy, doubt, eternity, love, and death with a precision that few poets have ever matched. While her contemporaries like Herman Melville or Walt Whitman were crossing oceans and borders to find their stories, she was crossing layers of consciousness. You don't need to go to the Alps to understand awe. You can find it in a thunderstorm outside your window. Her poems go places that maps cannot record. This is the heart of her solitude. It was not about shrinking her world to the size of a bedroom, it was about deepening it. From that one room, she entered what might be called an internal infinity. She created a space without edges, where thought and feeling could unfold without interruption. Her white dress, her locked door, and her quiet routines were not signs of an empty life. They were boundaries, carefully drawn to protect the fragile, burning intensity of her creation. She wrote nearly 1,800 poems in that room, a staggering output that changed literature forever. As this chapter settles into stillness, we are left with a gentle reassurance for our own lives. Solitude does not need to look dramatic. It does not require you to move to a cabin in the woods like Thoreau, or sit on a mountain like Petrarch. It does not require exile or wilderness. Sometimes solitude is just a room in a suburban house. Sometimes it is a desk. Sometimes it is a window. Sometimes it is simply the act of selecting your own society and turning off the notifications. Emily Dickinson shows us that the depth of a life is not measured by how many miles you travel or how many hands you shake. It is measured by how deeply you listen. And in her quiet white room, with the door shut tight, she listened more closely than almost anyone before or since.
Chapter 19. That epic rock moment. Nietzsche in the Alps. We climb now into the high, clear air of the Swiss Alps, leaving the dense cities and lowlands far behind. The valley is the Engadine, and the specific village is Sils Maria. If you haven't been there, picture a landscape that feels almost too perfect to be real. It is the 1880s, and the light here feels sharper, thinner, and more crystalline than anywhere else in Europe. The lakes reflect the sky like polished glass, and the mountains stand around the valley with a severe, indifferent calm. It is a place of jagged edges and breathtaking silence. This is where Friedrich Nietzsche came each summer between 1881 and 1888. He wasn't there for a holiday or to ski. He was there seeking relief from a body that was essentially rebelling against him. Nietzsche suffered from relentless migraines, violent nausea, and near blindness. He was physically fragile, often spending days in a darkened room in agony. But his mind, here in the thin air of the mountains, felt strangely unbound. He described the location as being 6,000 feet beyond man and time. Near the shore of Lake Silvaplana stands a massive, angular boulder, known today as the Nietzsche House Stone, or the Rock of Surlay. It rises from the earth like a pyramid placed there by a giant, solid and solitary, overlooking the water and the long sweep of the valley. Nietzsche walked past this stone again and again during his daily wanderings, and it was here, by this rock, in August of 1881, that one of the most unsettling and powerful ideas in the history of philosophy hit him. He later wrote that the thought struck him suddenly, with the force of a revelation.
It wasn't a gradual realization, it was a lightning bolt. Here's the thought experiment he crafted. Imagine a demon crept into your loneliness one night and whispered to you a secret. The secret is that you must live this very life again, exactly as it is, down to the smallest detail. Every joy, every pain, every friend, every enemy, every boredom, and every heartbreak will be repeated in the exact same sequence. There is no editing. There is no fixing it next time. You have to watch the same movie starring you on an infinite loop forever. This was the idea he called eternal recurrence. To a modern mind, this might sound like the plot of the movie Groundhog Day, but without the comedy and without the chance to learn piano or save the kid falling from the tree. Nietzsche wasn't offering this as a scientific claim about physics or time travel. He was offering it as the ultimate psychological stress test. He asked, would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth, cursing the demon? Or have you lived a moment so tremendous that you would say, you are a god, and I have never heard anything more divine? Nietzsche's days in Sils Maria followed a strict and solitary rhythm designed to answer that question with a yes. He rose early, often at dawn, when the air was still and the world felt unfinished. He worked through the morning, writing carefully because his eyesight was so poor, conserving his strength. Then, after a simple midday meal, he walked. And when I say walked, I don't mean a leisurely stroll. I mean he marched. He went on long, demanding hikes that could last 5, 6, even 7 hours. He moved through forests, along lake paths and up rocky slopes, always carrying small notebooks in his pockets to capture ideas before they escaped. He believed with almost religious conviction that thinking belonged to the body in motion. We tend to think of philosophy as something done by men sitting in armchairs smoking pipes. Nietzsche hated that image. He famously remarked that all truly great thoughts are conceived while walking. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a rule. He believed that sitting still caused the mind to become stagnant and conformist. He wanted thoughts that had blood and muscle in them. These walks were not restful in the gentle spa day sense. They were bracing, even dangerous. The altitude was high, the weather could turn from sunshine to snow in an hour, and he was often alone on treacherous paths. But this was exactly what he wanted. Nietzsche spoke often of what he called lofty solitude. He believed that most human thinking was shaped by what he called the bad air of the herd. In modern terms, think of the herd as the echo chamber of social media, the 24-hour news cycle, and the pressure to think exactly like your neighbors. He felt that these shared fears and morals smothered originality. To breathe freely, the spirit had to climb. It had to leave the crowded lowlands behind and get to an altitude where the air was thin and the view was clear. In this solitude, he believed, the self could be forged. This is where his idea of self-overcoming takes root. Nietzsche imagined the human spirit as something unfinished, a bridge, not a destination. Solitude, for him, was the workshop where you built that bridge. It wasn't a place of comfort or hygge. It was a nest built high on the cliffs where the eagle of the spirit could grow strong enough to fly into the storm. There is a wildness to this vision. Nietzsche never pretended otherwise. He knew that such solitude could feel cold, dangerous, and terrifying. He once described himself as a dark forest, warning that not everyone would dare to enter. But for those who did, for those who weren't afraid of the dark, he promised unexpected beauty and a kind of freedom that most people never taste. As the alpine wind moves across the dark water of the lake and the rock of Surley grows black against the twilight sky, the question lingers softly but persistently in the silence. If this moment, this exact life you are living right now, were to return again and again forever, would you be crushed? Or would you have the strength to look at it and say, yes? Chapter 20. Embracing Your Loneliness. Rilke to a Young Poet. We step now into early 20th century Europe, moving away from the rugged Alps and into a world of rented rooms, drafty apartments, and temporary addresses. This is a time before instant messaging or email, a time when communication was slow, deliberate, and physical. Letters traveled across borders in saddlebags and train cars, sometimes taking weeks to arrive. In this quiet, patient space, we find the voice of Rainer Maria Rilke. Rilke was writing from various locations, sometimes from the coast of Italy, sometimes from bustling cities like Paris or Rome. But his attention was focused on a young man named Franz Xavier Capus. Capus was a 19-year-old military cadet who was stuck in a dilemma that feels very modern. He was torn between a practical, safe career in the military and a burning, confusing desire to be a poet. Unsure of his talent and terrified of his future, he sent his poems to Rilke, asking for a critique. What he got back was not a red pen correction of his verses or a how-to guide on getting published. Instead, Rilke sent him 10 letters that have become a survival guide for anyone trying to live a creative or authentic life. Rilke offered him guidance not on how to write, but on how to live with uncertainty. And at the absolute center of that guidance is the concept of solitude. Rilke speaks to this young cadet with remarkable tenderness, sounding less like a distant professor and more like a careful older guardian or a wise older brother. He doesn't try to sugarcoat the experience of being alone. He doesn't dismiss the pain of it. Instead, he invites the cadet to turn directly toward it. He tells him to love his solitude and even to try to sing with the pain it brings. This is a radical shift in perspective. Usually, when we feel lonely, we treat it like a symptom of an illness, something to be cured, fixed, or distracted from immediately. Rilke suggests that this pain is actually growing pains. It isn't a flaw or a failure. It is evidence that something inside is stretching. Just as a body aches when it grows, the soul aches when it expands into a wider inner space. Loneliness in this view is not emptiness, it is expansion. Rilke gently reframes isolation as a sign of becoming. He argues that when our familiar supports fall away, when we lose a job, end a relationship, or move to a new city, we feel lost. But that loss is actually the clearing of ground for something new. The soul is forced to develop new muscles and new strengths that it never needed when things were easy. Solitude, he insists, is not something to escape too quickly by scrolling through a phone or rushing into a crowd, because it is doing important structural work on your character. His thoughts on relationships follow this same quiet, profound logic. In these letters, Rilke offers one of the most enduring and healthy definitions of love in modern literature. We often grow up with the Hollywood idea of love as fusion, two people becoming one, completing each other's sentences and dissolving into a single unit. Rilke thought this was a disaster. He describes true love as two solitudes that protect, border, and greet each other. Love, in his eyes, is an act of mutual guardianship. It isn't about losing yourself in someone else, it's about standing next to them. Each person remains whole, intact, and inwardly free. This idea can feel almost countercultural even today. It reassures us that needing space doesn't mean you lack affection. It confirms that maintaining your own inner room isn't selfish, it's actually necessary for a healthy relationship. True closeness, Rilke suggests, only becomes possible when each person knows how to stand alone. If you can't be alone, you aren't really loving the other person. You are just using them as a shield against your own loneliness. Again and again, Rilke returns to childhood as the ultimate model for this capacity. He urges the young poet to look backward and recover the vastness he once knew as a child. Think about how children play. They can spend hours alone in a corner with a few blocks or a sketchbook, mumbling to themselves, building entire worlds in their heads.
They don't feel lonely in the sad sense. They are just inhabiting their own rich inner world. Being alone was natural to them. Rilke reminds us that we lost this ability as we grew up and started worrying about social approval. He encourages us to carry that childhood capacity forward into adult life. He suggests that it is possible to carry your solitude with you even into crowds and into relationships. You can be at a dinner party, nodding and speaking, while still keeping a quiet, protected space inside yourself. This is what he calls fertile solitude. It is not a withdrawal from life or a refusal to participate. It is a preparation for life. Solitude becomes the workshop where the self is shaped, where your values are clarified, and where creative and emotional strength quietly matures. It's like the root system of a tree. Nothing flashy is happening down there in the dark. There is no applause, no Instagram likes, and no immediate reward. But that is where the stability comes from. Without that deep, quiet work, the tree falls over the first time the wind blows. The tone of these letters is deeply reassuring because Rilke does not rush the young poet toward answers. He famously tells him to be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart. He advises him to live the questions now. It's a beautiful relief for anyone who feels like they need to have their life figured out by age 25. Rilke says, you don't, you can't, you have to live your way into the answers. As this chapter softens into silence, we are left with a gentle permission. You do not have to solve everything today. You do not have to view your loneliness as a defect. Solitude, Rilke whispers across the century, is not a prison sentence. It is a companion. And if you learn to sit with it, to listen to it carefully without panicking, it may become one of the most faithful guides you ever have.
Chapter 21. Claiming Your Own Space. Virginia Woolf. We step now into the lush green English countryside, specifically into the gentle stillness of Sussex in the early 20th century. We are leaving the smog and noise of London behind for a place where the rhythm of life is dictated by the weather and the tides. The house is Monk's house in the village of Rodmell. It is a modest, weather-beaten place, surrounded by fields, fruit trees, and slow-moving days. And tucked away in the garden, beneath the shade of trees and with a view toward the rolling downs and the distant church tower, stands a small wooden building. This is where Virginia Woolf went each morning to work. If you are picturing a luxurious, high-end home office with ergonomic furniture and perfect climate control, erase that image. The structure was originally a simple tool shed. It was drafty in the winter and stiflingly hot in the summer. It was often filled with the smell of rotting apples because they stored the orchard's harvest in the loft above. But Woolf transformed this humble shack into her writing lodge. Each day she would follow a strict routine. She would leave the main house, cross the damp grass of the garden, and step into this small, private room. Inside there was a simple desk, an old chair, and the smell of ink and paper mixing with the wood. The most important feature, however, was the door. It could be closed. It could be locked. The world, with its dinner parties, domestic duties, and endless interruptions, could be held at a gentle distance. This daily walk across the lawn mattered more than it might seem. It was a mental commute. It was a ritual of claiming space. It was a quiet but firm declaration that her thought deserved shelter and that her imagination required protection from the mundane demands of the household. These lived details connect directly to her most famous argument in the essay A Room of One's Own. When Woolf spoke about solitude, she didn't speak in vague, spiritual, or abstract terms. She spoke about cold, hard economics. She spoke about locks, income, privacy, and time. She famously argued that creative freedom is not just a matter of having a brilliant soul or a poetic nature, it is a matter of material conditions. She stated plainly that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. Specifically, she mentioned an income of £500 a year and a lock on the door. This was revolutionary. For centuries, women's lives had been defined by the lack of privacy. Think of Jane Austen, who wrote in the family sitting room and had to hide her manuscripts under a blotter whenever someone walked in. She was constantly subject to interruption. Woolf argued that you cannot think deeply if you are always bracing yourself for someone to ask you where the tea towels are. A person needs enough money not to be dependent on a patron or a spouse, and a physical space where they can be completely alone. Only then, she believed, could the mind truly sink down into its own depths. Woolf often described consciousness as a kind of river, deep and flowing beneath the surface of daily life. This is the famous stream of consciousness style she pioneered in books like Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. Solitude was the tool that allowed her to descend into that river. The writing lodge wasn't an escape from reality, it was a submarine that allowed her to dive deeper into it. She needed the silence to catch the fleeting, half-formed thoughts that vanish the moment someone knocks on the door. And yet, we have to be honest about the complexity here. Woolf understood the danger of solitude as well as the beauty of it. For Woolf, solitude was never simple. She struggled with severe mental illness throughout her life. She knew from painful experience that silence could nourish creativity, but it could also open the door to terror. The same inward attention that made great writing possible could, if unanchored, dissolve into the frightening isolation of depression, into what she called the voices. When you spend that much time in your own head, you risk getting lost in there.
This is why the wider setting of Monk's house sows much. Outside the writing lodge was not emptiness, there was care. Her husband, Leonard Woolf, was constantly nearby. He tended the garden, pulled weeds, managed their publishing business, and maintained the rhythms of domestic life. He made sure she ate lunch. He made sure she stopped working when her headaches started. There was order, routine, and companionship close by, acting as a safety net. The solitude was held within a frame of stability. This balance is central to her vision, and it's a lesson for us today. Solitude works best when it is supported by community. You can go deep because you know there is someone waiting for you on the surface. Solitude, for Woolf, was not a withdrawal from the world, but a condition for participating in it honestly. And it was deeply political. For centuries, women had been denied private space, denied uninterrupted time, and denied ownership of their own attention. To ask for a room of one's own was to challenge history itself. It was an act of rebellion. The room, she insisted, was both literal and symbolic. It stands for any protected space where thought can unfold without fear, interruption, or judgment. It stands for the right to say, "Do not disturb," and have that request respected. As evening settles over the Sussex garden and the writing lodge grows dim, this chapter leaves us with a calm but powerful idea that resonates in our modern world of open-plan offices and constant digital notifications. Solitude is not a luxury for the wealthy or the idle. It is not selfish to want an hour to yourself.
For Woolf, it was the foundation of freedom. It is about the dignity of having a space, whether it's a shed, a study, or just a quiet corner of a coffee shop, where you are the captain of your own attention. It requires a small room, a closed door, and the courage to claim them. Chapter 22. The Dangers of Forced Loneliness. Hannah Arendt. We move now into the 20th century, leaving behind the romantic cabins and alpine hikes. We are stepping into a much darker landscape, one shaped by industrial-scale violence, mass propaganda, and the terrifying collapse of shared reality. The voice guiding us here belongs to Hannah Arendt, a chain-smoking, brilliant Jewish philosopher who fled Nazi Germany and spent the rest of her life trying to understand how civilization could go so wrong so quickly. Writing in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the rise of Stalinism, Arendt's work doesn't speak softly, it speaks with the urgency of a survivor. In her massive, groundbreaking book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she offers one of the clearest and most unsettling analyses of loneliness ever written. But she asks us to slow down and be very precise with our words, because in her view, not all forms of being alone are the same. In fact, mixing them up can be dangerous. She breaks down the experience of being alone into 3 distinct categories: solitude, isolation, and loneliness. First, she speaks of solitude. For Arendt, this is a positive, healthy state. Solitude is the state of being alone with oneself. It is the quiet inner dialogue where true thinking happens. She famously describes this as the 2-in-1. When you are in solitude, you are physically alone, but you are not abandoned, because you are in the company of your own mind. You are having a conversation with yourself. Think about when you have a moral dilemma. You might say to yourself, "I can't do that. I wouldn't be able to live with myself." That phrase, "live with myself," proves Arendt's point. There are 2 of you in there. This 2-in-1 dialogue is where conscience forms, where judgment is tested, and where ideas are examined before they are spoken out loud. In solitude, I am my own partner. Then there is isolation. Isolation is different. It usually relates to the world of work or political action. Isolation happens when you are focused on a task, like an artist painting or a carpenter building a table, or when a tyrant stops you from gathering with others to make political changes. You might still be able to think, and you might still have a rich inner life, but you are cut off from the public sphere. You can make things, but you can't act with others. Isolation is limiting, and it can be frustrating, but Arendt argues it isn't necessarily catastrophic. It's like being stuck in a cubicle. You are productive, but politically powerless. The most dangerous condition comes last: loneliness. Loneliness, as Arendt defines it, is terrifyingly specific. It is not just missing your friends. It is the experience of being deserted by both the world and yourself. It happens when that inner 2-in-1 dialogue breaks down. You lose the ability to trust your own thoughts. You feel that you don't belong anywhere in the world, and worse, you don't even feel at home in your own head. This is the emotional soil in which totalitarianism grows. Arendt introduces the concept of organized loneliness. She explains that totalitarian regimes, like the Nazis or the Soviets, didn't just use terror and secret police to control people. They systematically destroyed the 2 spheres that protect human dignity. First, they dismantled the private sphere. By using informants, neighbors watching neighbors, children reporting parents, they made it impossible to trust anyone. When you can't trust anyone, you stop talking. When you stop talking, you eventually stop thinking, because thinking is a dialogue. This destroys solitude. Then they dismantled the public sphere. They banned free press, gatherings, and unions, destroying the shared reality where we check our facts with others. What remains is a population that is profoundly alone, fearful, and disconnected. Arendt argued that the ideal subject of a totalitarian state is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exists. When people are this lonely, when they are uprooted and have no connection to a community or their own inner self, they become desperate for something to hold on to. They become vulnerable to the logic of a movement. A dictator comes along and says, "Forget your confusing life. Here is a simple story. You are part of the master race," or "You are part of the great revolution." For a lonely person, that rigid logic acts like a substitute for the community they lost. This helps explain a modern phenomenon we see today, radicalization. We often wonder how someone falls down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories or extremism. Arendt would say, look at their loneliness. Look at how disconnected they are. If you strip away a person's ability to sit with themselves, solitude, and their ability to connect with reality, community, they will grab on to the first angry ideology that offers them a sense of purpose. This is why Arendt places such incredible importance on thinking. For her, thinking is not an academic exercise for professors in tweed jackets. It is a survival skill. It is a moral brake pedal. As long as a person can carry on that quiet conversation between me and myself, they are never fully abandoned to the mob. They can pause, they can question, they can say, wait a minute, this feels wrong. Arendt famously covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a major organizer of the Holocaust. She was shocked to find him wasn't a spooky, demonic monster. He was a terrifyingly normal bureaucrat who spoke in clichés. He was a man who had simply switched off the two-in-one dialogue and just followed the rules. This chapter feels heavier than the others, and it should, but its message is quietly protective. Arendt is reminding us that solitude, properly understood, is not a retreat from responsibility, it is a defense against manipulation. The capacity to sit alone with your thoughts, to reflect without slogans, algorithms, or peer pressure, is a form of resistance. As the night deepens, her warning softens into reassurance. Even in the worst historical catastrophes, there remains one refuge that cannot easily be taken away, the inner space where thinking happens, the quiet room where the self still speaks to itself. To care for that solitude, to protect your alone time from the noise of the world, is not selfish, it is essential. It is the thing that keeps us human.
Chapter 23. Night Watch in Silence. Thomas Merton.
We step quietly now into the American countryside of the 1950s, specifically into the deep, rolling hills of Kentucky. We are entering the Abbey of Gethsemane, a place of profound stillness. Most of the monastery is asleep. The halls are dark. The air is cool and steady, and the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight. Moving softly through this scene is a man in a monk's habit, wearing sneakers to muffle his steps. This is Thomas Merton. By this point, he is already a famous writer. His autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain, has become a massive bestseller. But here, in the dark, he isn't a celebrity. He is just a Trappist monk on a rotating chore roster. He is on fire watch. Practically speaking, this duty was mundane. It required him to walk through the sprawling monastery complex while the other monks slept, checking for sparks, smoke, or embers. In an old building full of wood and straw, fire was a genuine threat. So Merton would patrol the barns, the library, the choir, and the utility rooms. It was a practical responsibility, quiet and repetitive. But for Merton, this nightly patrol became something far more meaningful than a safety check. It became a spiritual masterclass. As he walked, the monastery revealed itself to him in ways invisible during the day. He noted the sensory details in his journals with the eye of a poet. He smelled the faint sweetness of beeswax candles that had just been extinguished. He smelled the cedar of the closets and the old wood holding the day's warmth. He saw moonlight falling across the cloisters, turning the rough stone into pale silver. In this profound silence, you might expect Merton to feel lonely or cut off from the real world of cities and politics, but he felt the exact opposite. He felt intensely, almost painfully connected to it. Later, writing in his journal, The Sign of Jonas, he described the night as eloquent. Sitting in silence after his rounds, he found that the absence of noise did not erase meaning, it revealed it. The quiet became a language of its own. It was a time when the distractions of the ego, the need to be Thomas Merton, the writer, fell away, and he could just be a human being standing in the dark. During these hours, Merton experienced a massive shift in how he understood solitude. Early in his monastic life, Merton had imagined solitude as an escape. He had fled to the monastery to get away from the noise, violence, and confusion of the modern world, what he called the city of men. He wanted to build a wall between himself and the chaos. But during nights like these, moving gently through the sleeping abbey, he realized that his earlier view was wrong. He realized that true silence did not separate him from humanity, it bound it to it. In the stillness, he felt what he later described as a fierce, almost protective love for the world. The silence allowed him to see more clearly. He sensed the suffering, hope, and fragility of human life not as distant, abstract ideas, but as something close and precious. He realized that the monk doesn't leave the world to judge it. He leaves the world to save himself from drowning in it so he can love it better. In the famous epilogue to The Sign of Jonas, known as the Fire Watch, Merton wrote of hearing a voice in the silence. It wasn't a hallucination, it was a deep internal reassurance that what had seemed broken or worthless in the world was in fact cherished. He came to understand that mercy overshadowed everything. Nothing was truly abandoned. This realization led him to one of his most enduring and beautiful ideas, the point vierge, or the virgin point. This is a concept that resonates deeply, even if you aren't religious. Merton suggested that at the center of every person there is a point of nothingness that is untouched by sin, fear, ambition, or social labels. It is the one spot in us that the world cannot mess up. It shines quietly like a hidden diamond. It is our true self, buried beneath the false self of our resumes, our anxieties, and our egos. In solitude, Merton believed, we learn to see this spark in ourselves. And once we see it in ourselves, we can't help but see it in everyone else, even people we disagree with, even people who annoy us. We realize that everyone has this hidden gold inside them. The image of the fire tower, where Merton also spent time alone later in his life, deepens this meaning. A watchtower is not a place of withdrawal or hiding, it is a place of responsibility. The watcher does not climb the tower to get away from the trees, he climbs it to protect them. He looks outward, alert and attentive, guarding what others cannot see while they rest. This is how the mature Thomas Merton came to understand solitude. It isn't isolation, it isn't an escape hatch, it is vigilance. To be alone in this sense is to stand watch for the world. It is to hold the world in awareness and care when everyone else is too busy, too tired, or too distracted to pay attention.
Silence becomes an act of solidarity, a way of loving the world quietly but fiercely. As the night deepens and the monastery sleeps on, Merton's footsteps fade into the stillness of the Kentucky hills, and with them comes a gentle truth for us. Sometimes the most meaningful connection we can make to the world is found not in posting, speaking, or arguing, but in keeping watch in silence.
Chapter 24. Playing the Fool. Ryokan's Fun Solitude. We travel now to Japan, specifically to the quiet, snow-covered mountains of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The path is narrow and winding, leading us away from the rigid social structures of the time. Tucked away on the slopes of Mount Kugami stands a small, humble hut with a name that already feels like a smile. It is called Go-Go-On, which translates roughly to the half measure of rice hermitage. This is where Ryokan lived. If you have an image in your head of a Zen master as a stern, unsmiling figure who hits people with sticks to make them enlightened, you need to delete that immediately. Ryokan was the total opposite. He was a Zen monk, a master calligrapher, and a poet, but he often referred to himself by another name, Daigu, the Great Fool. This wasn't an insult, and it wasn't false modesty. It was a choice. In a society obsessed with status, honor, and rigid propriety, Ryokan embraced foolishness as the ultimate freedom. He saw that being smart often meant being calculating, manipulative, or stressed. Being a fool, on the other hand, meant dropping the mask. It meant embracing simplicity as wisdom and treating solitude not as a serious discipline, but as a playground where joy could arrive without effort. His life was materially poor by any standard. His hut was tiny, drafty, and barely furnished. He owned almost nothing, a begging bowl, a robe, maybe a few books, and yet his days were full. There is a story about a bamboo shoot that captures his spirit perfectly. One spring, a bamboo shoot began to grow beneath the floorboards of his hut. Bamboo is strong and relentless. It pushes upward with incredible force. Most of us, if we found a plant trying to destroy our living room floor, would cut it down without a second thought. We value our property over nature. Ryokan did not. He looked at the bamboo and decided he had no right to stop it. Instead, he got his saw and cut a hole in his own floorboards. Later, when the bamboo grew too tall for the room, he didn't trim it. He climbed up and cut a hole in the roof so the bamboo could continue growing toward the sky. He chose inconvenience over harm. He chose to let the rain come in rather than stifle a living thing. This was Ryokan's way of being alone in the world, not separated from it by walls, but gently making room for it, even if it meant getting wet. Ryokan also had a reputation that confused the serious adults of his time. He preferred the company of children. The kids from the nearby villages loved him. They didn't see him as a holy man. They saw him as the funny old guy who was always down to play. They would play games together, laugh, and chase each other through the fields. He would even participate in their games of dead or alive, completely forgetting his dignity. In one well-loved story, Ryokan was playing hide-and-seek with the village kids. He took the game very seriously. He found a haystack and buried himself deep inside to hide. He waited quietly, giggling to himself. Time passed.
The children searched for a while, but kids being kids, they eventually got bored or distracted and drifted home as the evening sun went down. They totally forgot about the monk in the hay. Ryokan, still hiding and feeling very proud of his spot, eventually fell asleep. The next morning, a farmer came out to tend the fields and poked the haystack with a pitchfork or just moved the hay, discovering a monk curled up inside. Ryokan opened his eyes, saw the farmer, and whispered urgently, "Shh, be quiet, the children will find me." He didn't realize the game had ended 12 hours ago. There is no sadness in this story. There is only tenderness. It shows a man who lived so fully in the present moment that time itself seemed to loosen his grip on him. He wasn't sitting in that haystack worrying about his career or his retirement plan. He was just hiding. His poetry reflects this same lightness of spirit. Ryokan is famous for his haiku-like simplicity, often writing about everyday things that other poets ignored. But the most famous incident involves a burglary. One night, a thief broke into his hut. The thief searched high and low, but found absolutely nothing worth taking. Not money, not jewels, not even a nice set of plates. As the thief was leaving, confused and empty-handed, Ryokan woke up. Instead of shouting or fighting, he supposedly felt bad that the thief had come all this way for nothing. He famously offered the thief the clothes off his back or his bedding, just so the man wouldn't leave empty-handed. After the confused thief ran away, Ryokan sat naked, looking out at the night sky. He then wrote a single luminous haiku that has echoed through the centuries. The thief left it behind, the moon at my window. It hits you in the gut. He had lost his few material possessions, but he realized he hadn't lost anything essential. The moon was still there. The beauty of the world had not been stolen. In fact, now that the room was empty, the view was even better. For Ryokan, solitude was never grim, severe, or scary. It was warm, playful, and open. He wrote poems on scraps of parchment because he couldn't afford fresh parchment. He laughed easily. He found delight in small things, a bouncing ball, a passing cloud, a quiet evening. His poverty was real, but so was his abundance. This is why Ryokan is often called a divine fool. He refused the seriousness that so often accompanies spiritual striving. We tend to think that to be deep, we have to be somber. Ryokan showed that wisdom doesn't always wear a stern face. Sometimes wisdom laughs. Sometimes wisdom forgets the rules of the game and hides in a haystack anyway. As this chapter settles into calm, Ryokan leaves us with a gentle reminder that we desperately need in our high-pressure world. Solitude does not have to be heavy. It does not have to be a heroic struggle or a severe discipline. It can be light. It can be kind. It can be full of laughter. In a small hut on a mountain, with a hole in the roof and the moon at the window, Ryokan shows us that being alone can feel very much like being at home.
Chapter 25. Cicadas Breaking the Quiet. Basho's Haiku. We walk now along a narrow, dusty mountain path in Japan, back in the late 17th century. The traveler beside us is Matsuo Basho, and frankly, he looks exhausted. It is the summer of 1689, and he is deep into the journey that would eventually become the most famous travel diary in Japanese literature, Okuno Hosomichi, or The Narrow Road to the Deep North. Basho isn't a young man on a gap year. He is 45 years old, which was considered quite advanced for the time, and his body is feeling every mile. His sandals are worn thin, his legs are aching, but his attention remains incredibly sharp.
Late in the afternoon, Basho reaches Yamadera, a stunning mountain temple complex built high into a rocky cliff face. To get to the main hall, you have to climb. It's not a gentle slope, it's a steep, grueling ascent of over 1,000 stone steps. With each step upward, the trivial noise of the world, the village gossip, the worries about money, the fatigue of travel, seems to fall away. The physical exertion forces a kind of mental clarity. Your breath becomes heavier, but your thoughts grow fewer. When he finally reaches the top, he stops to catch his breath. The air is perfectly still. The massive volcanic rock walls hold the day's warmth, radiating it back out. Nothing moves. And yet, the silence isn't empty or sterile like a soundproof booth. From somewhere unseen comes the piercing, vibrating cry of cicadas. If you've never heard Japanese cicadas in late summer, you have to understand that this isn't a gentle chirping, it is an industrial-grade wall of sound. It is sharp, relentless, and loud, almost like a high-tension wire buzzing or a microscopic buzzsaw. Most of us, standing there after a long hike, might find it annoying. We might cover our ears or wish they would just shut up so we could enjoy the view. But Basho listens differently. He doesn't resist the sound, he doesn't wish it away, he allows it to fill the moment completely. And then, quietly, he writes one of the most famous haiku in history. Ah, the silence, sinking into the rocks, the voice of the cicada. In this tiny poem, something incredibly subtle and paradoxical happens. The cicada's cry does not break the silence, it becomes the silence. Basho uses a verb that implies the sound is physically drilling or soaking into the stone, shimi-iru. It suggests permeability. The sound penetrates the rock just as his awareness penetrates the present moment. In Basho's mind, there is no separation between the background noise and the peace of the temple. The sheer intensity of the cicada's cry and the way the rocks seem to absorb it creates a sensation that is deeper than total quiet. What we might normally dismiss as noise is revealed as depth. This is where Basho's specific understanding of solitude lives, and it relies on a Japanese aesthetic concept known as sabi. Sabi is a difficult word to translate. It is often rendered as loneliness or solitude, but that makes it sound depressing. In reality, it carries a softer, more accepting tone. Sabi is the beauty of things that are worn, quiet, and impermanent. It is the feeling of autumn, even in the heat of summer. It is the feeling of standing alone with time, seeing the moss on the rock and feeling a sense of deep, melancholic peace. It is the appreciation of the old and the faded. In Basho's poem, the vast, ancient permanence of the rocks and the fragile, fleeting life of the insect are not in conflict. They belong together. The cicada does not disturb the mountain receives the cicada. Solitude here is not an absence of sensation, it is total presence. This is a massive lesson for us in the modern world. We tend to think of solitude as a sterile environment. We buy noise-canceling headphones, we try to soundproof our apartments, we get angry when a car alarm goes off or the refrigerator hums too loudly. We are constantly dividing the world into silence, good, and noise, bad. But Basho invites us to flip that switch. He suggests that if we stop fighting the background sounds of life, they can actually help us settle down. Think about the hum of distant traffic on a rainy night, or the rhythmic ticking of a clock, or the sound of a fan spinning in the corner. When we resist these sounds, they irritate us. But when we accept them, when we let them sink into the rock of our minds, they dissolve into a kind of stillness. They become the texture of the moment. As this chapter gently fades, Basho leaves us with a quiet, practical lesson. Solitude is not found by eliminating every single decibel of sound from your life. That's impossible unless you're in a vacuum. True solitude is found by listening so fully and with such acceptance that sound loses its power to distract you. In the mountains of Yamadera, with the cicadas screaming their short lives into the ancient stone, Basho shows us that silence is not the absence of life, it is life heard deeply.
Chapter 26. Hunting for Modern Hermits. Bill Porter's Journey. We arrive now in the late 20th century, specifically in the year 1989. The scene shifts dramatically from the western landscapes we've been exploring to the rugged, mist-covered peaks of the Zhongnan Mountains in China. Clouds cling to steep slopes, and narrow, treacherous paths wind upward into the gray fog. Walking these trails is an American named Bill Porter, though in the literary world he is better known by his pen name, Red Pine. Porter is a fascinating character, a translator of ancient Chinese poetry, and a man deeply in love with the culture. But on this trip, he isn't searching for ancient scrolls, ruined temples, or legends. He is searching for living people. His question is simple, but given the time and place, it is quietly radical. Do the hermits still exist? To understand why this question mattered, you have to look at the context. This was 1989. China had spent decades undergoing massive political upheaval. The Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s had been aggressively hostile toward religion and tradition. Monks were forced to return to lay life, temples were smashed, and the idea of spiritual retreat was seen as counter-revolutionary and parasitic. Modernization was sweeping through the cities. The general assumption among scholars and locals alike was that the ancient tradition of mountain reclusion, which had existed for thousands of years, was extinct. It was like looking for a dinosaur. Everyone assumed the lineage had been broken. But Porter had a hunch. He wanted to know if anyone had managed to slip through the cracks of history. He wanted to know if there were still people choosing to leave the world behind, to live alone among rocks, trees, and caves. The climb to find out was not a Sunday stroll. Porter followed slippery, mud-slicked trails that twisted through dense forests. The air grew thinner with every mile. The paths grew quieter. Occasionally, he would hear nothing but the sound of his own labored breathing and the wind moving through the pine branches. It felt, at times, as though he wasn't just walking up a mountain, but walking backward through time. And then, to his absolute amazement, he found them. Hidden among the craggy cliffs were caves, small mud huts, and stone shelters. Smoke rose faintly from openings in the rock, signaling a fire for tea or warmth. Inside these humble dwellings lived monks and nuns, some in their 80s, some surprisingly young, who had chosen a life of near total simplicity. When Porter arrived, exhausted and covered in mud, they didn't look shocked. They greeted him without surprise, as if visitors from the modern world arrived every day, or perhaps as if time itself just wasn't very important up there. In one memorable encounter, Porter sits down in a cave to share tea with a hermit. The setting is as spare as it gets: a blackened kettle, a few chipped bowls, and a dirt floor. The quiet in the cave feels almost physical, like a heavy blanket. Porter asks the obvious question that any of us would ask: why? Why live here, so far from comfort, medicine, and society? The answer he gets is disarmingly plain. The hermit doesn't give a long sermon on metaphysics or the nature of the universe. He simply says, for the quiet. Zen monks like quiet. There is no complex philosophy attached to it. No justification is offered. Quiet is enough. It's a striking contrast to our modern need to justify everything with productivity or results.
For this monk, the ROI of living in a cave was simply the absence of noise. In another encounter that Porter describes in his book, Road to Heaven, he meets a hermit who seems barely aware of the world below the clouds. When Porter asks about the government or recent political leaders, the man appears indifferent or gently confused. He asks questions that imply he missed the last 40 or 50 years of history. Dynasties have risen and fallen. Chairman Mao came and went. The economy opened up. None of it disturbed the rhythm of his days. The mountain operates on geological time, not political time. What emerges from these encounters is not just a sense of nostalgia, but a profound realization about resilience. Porter discovered that solitude is not a fragile, delicate tradition that depends on stable politics or the support of emperors. It is tough. It survives revolutions. It outlasts ideologies. As long as there are mountains or even small corners of quiet, there will be people drawn to them like magnets. Porter recorded these journeys in Road to Heaven, but the message of the book is really not about travel. It is about continuity. He proved that the same human impulse that sent poets and sages into the Zhongnan Mountains 1,000 years ago is still alive and well today. The technology changes, the governments change, but the hunger for silence remains constant. And crucially, this impulse isn't confined to China. This chapter gently widens its gaze toward us, the listeners. You do not need a cave or a slippery mountain path to recognize this longing. The desire for a place of quiet, a space untouched by constant demands and notifications, is universal. In the modern world, it might not look like moving to a mud hut. It might appear as a wish to sit alone at dawn with a coffee before the house wakes up. It might be the urge to walk without headphones, or the relief of turning your phone to airplane mode for an hour. The road to heaven, in this sense, is not a destination on a map. It is a direction. It is the choice to turn away from the noise, even for a moment. Bill Porter's journey reassures us that choosing solitude does not mean rejecting the world or hating humanity. It means remembering something ancient about being human, that sometimes peace is found not by adding more to our lives, but by stepping aside and listening. As the chapter settles into stillness, we are left with a simple, hopeful thought. If hermits can still be found on misty mountains after centuries of upheaval, war, and modernization, then the path to quiet is never truly lost. It is always there, waiting. It may begin far away in the peaks of the Zhongnan Range, or it may begin right where you are, the moment you decide to close the door and sit still.
Chapter 27. The Good Kind of Silence. Buddhist Balance.
After walking through centuries of history, meeting Western philosophers in the Alps, poets in the Lake District, and hermits in the Chinese mountains, we are circling back to a tradition that has been quietly guiding people through the landscape of the mind for more than 2,000 years. We are returning to the roots of Buddhism. But we aren't looking at it as a religion of temples and incense. We are looking at it as a practical psychology of solitude. In the Buddhist tradition, silence is given a very careful and specific name, noble silence, or in the original Pali, Aryo Tunhibhavo. Right away, this label tells us something crucial. The tradition is making a distinction. It suggests that there is a common silence and a noble one. Noble silence is not simply the absence of speech. It isn't just zipping your lip or sitting in a soundproof room. It is the presence of awareness. It is not about muteness. It is about mindfulness. In Buddhist teaching, silence becomes noble only when it is grounded in attention, clarity, and care.
A person can be physically quiet while seething in rage, consumed by jealousy, or lost in a fantasy world. That kind of silence isn't nourishing, it's actually exhausting. Noble silence, by contrast, is alive. It is a state where you allow thoughts to arise and pass without chasing them or fighting them. It creates a space for the world to exist without you constantly trying to narrate it. To feel this distinction more clearly, imagine the atmosphere of a modern silent meditation retreat. If you have never been to one, it might sound intimidating, but the reality is often surprisingly gentle. People gather together in a hall, sitting side by side, but they do not speak. They don't make eye contact. They don't apologize for bumping elbows. At mealtime, the silence continues. The only sounds are small, ordinary, and textured. The clink of a spoon against a ceramic bowl, the rustle of clothing, the chewing of food, the breath of people eating slowly. In a normal social setting, this would be excruciatingly awkward. We would feel the pressure to make small talk, to be entertaining, to fill the void. But in this context, the silence is shared, supportive, and agreed upon. No one is sulking, no one is being punished. Because the social pressure to perform is removed, a massive weight lifts off the shoulders. You realize how much energy you usually spend just projecting a personality. In the retreat, each person is quietly tending their own mind, like a gardener tending a plot of land, alongside others doing the same. This is the opposite of what Buddhism would call ignoble silence. We all know what that feels like. It's the silent treatment after an argument with a partner. It's the heavy, suffocating silence of resentment, avoidance, or depression. That kind of silence closes the heart and builds a wall. Noble silence does the opposite. It steadies the heart. It opens a window. It allows a person to be fully present without the constant frantic impulse to explain, defend, or react to everything. In classical Buddhist texts, the term noble silence is sometimes used to describe the jhanas, deep states of meditative absorption where the inner chatter finally shuts up. In these moments, the mind isn't blank or asleep, it is incredibly bright, calm, and lucid. Awareness remains, but the commentary track, that voice in your head that judges everything, falls away. Nothing needs to be added to the moment. The Buddha himself practiced a version of this in his teaching style. There were times when people would come to him with endless, speculative metaphysical questions. Is the universe eternal? Is the soul the same as the body? The Buddha would often respond with silence. This wasn't because he didn't know the answer or because he was being evasive. It was an act of precision. He knew that getting tangled in intellectual arguments would only lead to more confusion and wouldn't help the person reduce their suffering. His silence was a way of saying, come back to what is real, come back to what is happening right now. This brings us to a very modern concern. If you read the news today, you'll see headlines about the loneliness epidemic. Many people worry that solitude is inherently unhealthy, that being alone too much shortens your life, weakens your immune system, or leads to cognitive decline. These are real concerns, and Buddhism does not deny the importance of connection. The Sangha, or community, is a central pillar after all. But it offers a different framing. It suggests that we need to distinguish between loneliness, which is painful isolation, and solitude, which is constructive aloneness. Buddhism teaches that a certain amount of solitude is necessary to observe the mind honestly. You have to step back to see the picture. Solitude allows us to see our habits, our fears, our cravings, and our knee-jerk reactions for what they really are. In this sense, solitude is like battening down the hatches of a ship during a storm. You don't do it to escape the ocean, you do it to stabilize the vessel so you don't capsize. At the same time, Buddhism insists on balance. This is the middle way. The goal isn't to run away to a cave forever and abandon your family. The goal is to integrate silence into your life so that you can be a better person for your family. Silence is meant to deepen compassion, not replace it. The practice is not to abandon the world, but to carry a pocket of silence into it. So how do we make this practical? How do we practice noble silence without going to a monastery? It starts with micro-habits. It's taking 3 seconds of quiet before you respond to a difficult email. It's taking a breath before you snap at your kids. It's choosing to walk from the car to the office without putting headphones in, just letting the world be what it is. It's deciding that for the first 10 minutes of the morning, you won't check your phone. Far from making us distant or aloof, this kind of practice makes us more available. Think about it. When your mind is less crowded with your own noise, listening to someone else becomes much easier. When your inner static settles down, patience grows naturally. Solitude, in this balanced form, strengthens our ability to meet others without being overwhelmed by them. As this chapter gently comes to rest, it offers a final grounding reminder. Silence does not have to mean disappearance. Solitude does not have to be separation. Noble silence is simply a way of being quietly awake, whether you are sitting alone in a room or standing in a crowded subway car. It is a way of letting the mind rest without shutting the heart. And in a world that rarely stops talking, shouting, and notifying, offering someone your full, silent presence is not only noble, it is one of the kindest things you can do.
Chapter 28. Wrapping Up. Mastering the Art of Being Alone.
We have finally arrived at the end of our journey together. We've hiked through the Alps, sat in cold caves in China, looked out of windows in Massachusetts, and paced around drafty towers in France. As we stand here at the finish line, it feels right to circle back to where we started, returning to that simple but profound distinction offered by the theologian Paul Tillich back in Chapter 1. He reminded us that language is wise and that it gives us 2 very different words for the act of being by ourselves. There is the pain of loneliness, and then there is the glory of solitude. What we have traced in this book, step by step and century by century, is the movement between those 2 poles. We've looked at how to take the raw, painful feeling of isolation and alchemize it into something golden. We've seen that loneliness is what happens when we feel abandoned, unimportant, or cut off from the tribe. It's a passive state. It's something that happens to us. Solitude, by contrast, is active. It is what emerges when we learn how to be with ourselves without fear. It is not an accident or a consolation prize for people who couldn't get a date on Friday night. It is a skill. It is something learned, practiced, and shaped over time, just like playing an instrument or learning a new language. Along the way, the great thinkers we visited didn't offer us a single magic pill. Instead, they offered us a toolbox. Think back to what we've gathered. From the earliest Buddhist texts, we picked up the armor of the rhinoceros. We learned that having a thick skin isn't about being unfeeling. It's about having the strength to walk your own path without needing constant validation from the herd. It's the ability to be steady without becoming hard. From Taoism and the story of the empty boat, we learned how to navigate conflict. We learned to let go of the heavy, fragile ego that demands to be respected in every interaction. We learned that if we stop taking everything personally, if we empty our boat, we can drift with the current of life rather than constantly crashing against it. From the Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius, we were handed the keys to the inner citadel.
This is the ultimate reminder that no matter how crazy the world gets, whether it's ancient Roman wars or modern Twitter feuds, there is a quiet fortress inside your mind that no one can enter unless you invite them in. From Montaigne, we inherited the concept of the back shop of the mind. This is the permission slip to have a private identity that has nothing to do with your job, your family, or your social media profile. It is the room where you belong only to yourself. From Wordsworth and his daffodils, we learned about the inward eye. We learned that solitude acts like a darkroom for the soul, allowing our memories to develop and ripen, turning fleeting moments of beauty into lasting reservoirs of joy. And from Emily Dickinson in her white dress, we learned the power of boundaries. We saw that closing the door isn't an act of rejection, it's an act of protection. It is the courage to safeguard your sensitivity and your focus in a world that is constantly trying to fragment your attention. Each of these images teaches the same lesson in a different dialect. They all tell us that solitude is not withdrawal. It isn't failure. It isn't a condition reserved for the unlucky, the strange, or the antisocial. Solitude is an art form. It is the place where we rest and repair ourselves. Think of it as a maintenance station. In a world of constant noise, input, and performance, solitude is where the soul stretches out, recovers its balance, and remembers what its own voice actually sounds like. It's where you figure out what you think rather than just repeating what you heard on a podcast. As this final chapter settles, I want you to imagine your own room. Don't think of it as it might have felt on difficult nights in the past, as a place of confinement, boredom, or restlessness where you doom-scrolled until 2 a.m. Try to see it as it is now, after this long journey. See it as a quiet space with a gentle light and a sense of openness. This room is no longer a cage of loneliness. It is a cathedral of stillness. And the most important thing to remember is that in this quiet, you are not actually alone. You are part of an invisible society. You have joined a quiet fellowship of people stretching across thousands of years who learned how to sit with themselves. You are in the company of poets who wrote on scraps of paper, monks who kept watch in the night, philosophers who walked up mountains, and wanderers who found peace in a hut. And now you are one of them. So when you close your eyes tonight, or when you find yourself alone on a Sunday afternoon, let it not be an escape from the world. Let it be an arrival. You aren't falling into emptiness. You are stepping into presence. You aren't slipping into isolation. You are stepping into a deep, steady, and fascinating companionship with yourself. This is the art of being alone. And the beautiful thing is, you already know how to begin. You just have to close the door.